I got loyalty, got royalty inside my DNA. I got love, peace, got war and peace inside my DNA. I got joy and pain and joy inside my DNA.
Hello guys, welcome back to my channel The Fanfic Fantasy. Join us as we explore the world of fanfiction and fantasy and bring you the best story and discussions. This is the 6th part of What If Tanjiro Time Traveled and Became a Demon? So give this video a like and subscribe for more videos in future. So let's get into the fanfic. I'm sorry, Suzuki-san, but what you remember was no dream. The world around Kaio froze and the sick feeling in her stomach intensified. No, that couldn't be. That couldn't be right. She shook her head at the girl, almost unable to breathe through the horror and shock. This is a prank. A cruel joke, she whispered. The woman shook her own head grimly. No, it isn't. We have been experimenting with a possible cure for demons, bringing them back to being human again. No, Kaio shouted angrily, feeling tears coming to her eyes. No, that's not true. You're lying. Kacho rose to her feet, holding out her hands placatingly. It is true, she said firmly, if warily. Why would I lie about something like that? I don't know. You want my husband, or my children. Then she gasped as it all came together. You steal children and raise them here to serve you. Kacho was shaking her head again. No, the children you've met are here because their families were killed by demons and they have nowhere else to go. A likely story. She was sobbing openly now, her heart beat so fast and she felt so sick. It couldn't be true, and she would not believe it. She tried to get to her feet, forcing her lethargic body to move. She had to get out of here. She had to. Suzuki-san, the young woman said, this time her voice full of warning. If you continue to strain yourself, I will be forced to sedate you. Stay away from me. Monster. Kidnapper. Why you? And that suddenly, the woman was no longer there. Kaio's eyes widened and she felt a presence behind her. I warned you, she heard the woman's voice and went to turn around. But a solid chop to the back of the neck sent her tumbling, mercifully, into unconsciousness. XXX. Shinobu walked as calmly as she could down the hallway of the butterfly mansion and tried not to seethe. How dare she? How dare she say such things about her and the girls? And she forced herself to take a deep breath. Though, she needed to be more understanding. That woman wasn't a demon any longer and Shinobu had to remember that. She'd gotten a glimpse of what that woman's memories were from her explanation, likely killing her own husband and devouring him. Unable to stop herself or even find the will to want to stop. Killing random strangers only to eat them too. For more than 40 years, Shinobu wouldn't want to remember a past like that either. That didn't stop the fact that what she'd said, what she'd accused Shinobu of. Ugh, she needed to find something to bind their newest patient to the bed with once she woke up. She had a feeling this would take a lot of explaining and probably more patience than she had at this point. But she was the doctor of the Corps and needs must. She tried to withhold a groan and only paused when she heard a distant, steady pounding. Frowning, she turned down the hallway she'd been about to pass and headed towards the sound. About halfway there, she realized where it was coming from and she put her hand on her blade. Then she withdrew said blade. If that was Shinazugawa and he attacked her, he would regret it. The heavy doorway came into view. She braced herself and reached for her keys. It only took her a couple of moments to unlock the door, but when she did, she stepped back, ready to pounce if necessary. Instead of Shinazugawa, though, all she saw was Kamado standing on the top step, his hand poised to knock. When the door opened, he smiled, yawned, and then rubbed his eye, peeking one blearily open to look at the insect pillar. Warning, Shinobu-san. It was entirely too cute of a picture for a demon. Any demon, ever, even with the glowing eyes and kanji written in them. Sighing, she reached behind him and closed the doorway. Good morning, Kamado, she replied as she locked the door again. I assume Shinazugawa-san isn't joining us. Kamado shook his head. Nah, he's still asleep. Dunno how long he'll stay like that. He stretched his arms over his head before pausing. Speaking of, how long have I been out? She finished locking the door and put her keys into her pocket before turning to him. 3 days. He frowned thoughtfully, then nodded. Sounds about right. He stretched his neck to one side and then the other. Is there any news for me? He asked. Oyakata-sama has okayed your request to go and see your family, she said as she turned and began to walk down the hall, gesturing for him to walk beside her. Half because she didn't want to turn her back to a demon when she didn't have to even if she did trust him, and half because he was a fellow Hashira and should be treated with that level of respect. Really? He asked happily. That'll be great. I know it's only a couple of months since I last saw them, but I'm really looking forward to it. I can't wait to see how far they've come in their training. My mom could almost perform the styles and was practicing breathing all the time. That was on top of keeping the house in order. I suppose she took over from Yurikodaki-sensei because they had to expand the house so all the kids could live there too. He seemed so happy, she almost hated to cut him off, but she also needed to let him know a couple more things. So when he took a deep breath, she calmly spoke. Kamado-san, I must also tell you that I cannot accompany you to your senseis. I will have another mission. The boy's face fell almost comically. He looked honestly upset at her words. That surprised her a bit. It wasn't exactly a secret in the core that she tended to keep people at arm's length. So what had endeared her so to the boy? Or perhaps it was a past life. If you won't, he finally said, frowning in puzzlement, who will be accompanying me? Diguro-obanai, the serpent pillar. Kamado blinked at her for several seconds while she just continued to smile at him. Well, okay then. I look forward to getting to know him. Shinobu actually paused at his happy expression. His still so genuine expression. This was the smiling, upbeat boy she'd initially gotten to know. But she remembered his words from a couple of days ago. I have to stay positive, though. Even if I have to force it, I can't let that go. Sometimes I feel like it's all I have left of me. They were far more similar than she would like to admit aloud, she realized. Kamado-san, she said, making sure her smile looked extra warm. You don't have to keep your facade up around me. I appreciate that you're upset I can't go. I'm honored you trust me. He seemed surprised by her words, but he quickly smiled again. This has to be the least angry I think I've ever seen you. Thank you. It was her turn to be surprised, eyes widening as she took in his words. I'm sorry, she said, thinking she needed clarification. His smile widened and he tapped his nose with one clawed finger. Even before I became, well, like this, he gestured to his body. I had an excellent sense of smell, to a point where I can smell a person's changing emotions. That's only become more potent since. Well, yeah, it does that every time. In any case, while I thank you in your invitation, I don't always have to force myself to be positive. I truly am looking forward to getting to know Aguro-san. Shinobu wasn't quite sure what to think of that, to be honest, but she did believe him. She also wondered how well the two of them would get along. She didn't think Igoro was as volatile as Shinazugawa tended to be, but he had a quiet stubbornness and distance about him. He supported and worked with other demon slayers and was extremely dedicated, but kept everyone at arm's length, more than Shinobu did, even. She wasn't sure if he did it on purpose or if that just happened to be his personality, though. One way or another, it should be interesting. Well, I wish you luck, she said with a smile. Thank you, he replied excitedly, and she believed he was actually excited. This boy. They walked along for a little longer in silence before he suddenly spoke up again. Oh, the lady I burned the demon out of. How is she? Did she? He faded off, fidgeting nervously. Did she die? Shinobu couldn't hold back a sigh. It was just so easy to be more herself around this boy. No, she replied. She woke up and seems to be doing all right physically, but she doesn't seem to think that any of her memories as a demon are real. Seeing as she killed her husband, I can't say I blame her. Kamado cringed and nodded. Memories from when the hunger takes over are not pleasant. She didn't comment on that for several seconds, instead looking over at him thoughtfully. So he had memories of killing and or eating his friends. His family, likely, from what she'd heard. Shinobu stopped and turned to him. Kamado-san, she said seriously. He paused and looked at her with a wide-eyed innocence that he really shouldn't have. It occurred to her to wonder, once again, if he did that on purpose. She suppressed a shudder and focused on what she wanted to ask him. Would you be willing to speak with her? I knocked her out, but she should be awake again soon. At the very least, you can prove that demons do exist and perhaps convince her she was one, and help her to begin to heal from such a terrible spiritual wound. He muttered, bringing a hand up to clutch at his chest as he looked down and away. Shinobu's expression softened. Yes. Then a surprising memory popped up of Kani reaching out to her when she'd been in a similar pose, speaking of their lost family. Hesitantly, awkwardly, she did the same. Instead of taking his hand as Kani had hers, she laid a hand on top of his, hoping that would be enough. If anything, you can prove that it's possible to overcome this. His expression, when he looked up at her, seemed so open and vulnerable she had a hard time believing this was the boy who had won against Waxing 3, driven off Waxing 2, and survived Waxing 1. This was the boy who had beaten 4 waning moons at once. But he looked so broken, so lost. I haven't overcome it at all, he said. For the first time in a long time, she gave her first warm smile when not talking to someone she considered family. I think you have, more than you realize. That pain will always be with you, hers always was, but you function and live and help others anyway. You're strong, Kamado-san, in more ways than just physically. If anything, he looked even more vulnerable after that. Had she said something wrong? She hadn't actually meant to this time. Then he stepped forward and threw his arms around her. Despite being 4 years younger, he was already taller than her, but it didn't feel like a hug between equals. More like she was an older sister, like she was hugging Kanao or Ai. So she put her hands on his back and patted it gently, hoping it didn't feel too stiff. A soft noise caused them both to turn and glance down the hallway. There at the end, looking far more expressive than Shinobu had seen her in a while, stood Kanao. Kamado practically lit up. "Tsuyuri-san," he said, letting Shinobu go and rushing down the hall, bright smile right back in place. "And Kamado Tanjiro, it's great to meet you. Shinobu-san speaks very highly of you." This kid was going to give her emotional whiplash, and she'd known she would ultimately fail when it came to keeping Kanao from meeting Kamado, especially with him staying at the butterfly estate. She just hoped she could hold off their meeting for longer. Kanao frowned and glanced past the boy, bowing lowly to her, meeting Shinobu's eyes. Shinobu wanted to sigh as she began to walk towards them but managed to hold it back. Her Tsuguko regarded the boy in front of her for several seconds before she reached into her pocket. This time Shinobu did sigh, reminding herself that it was still better than before. That became harder and harder to believe after more than 3 years. Kanao flipped her coin and seemed pleased when it landed. Well, that was an improvement at least. She nodded, still holding her coin in her hand, and met Kamado's eyes. "You're a demon," she said to him. Yeah," he said sheepishly, rubbing the top of his head and probably smiling that huge smile of his that looked just as scary as it did friendly due to those teeth. "Sorry, it's a long story. Shinobu-san can tell you all about it, though, if I don't get a chance to." He turned that smile back on her. This child would be the death of all of them, giving off such sunshine like that. She sighed again. "Kanao," she said as she approached them, her normal smile back in place. "This is our son pillar, Kamado Tanjiro." Realization came to Kanao's eyes and she bowed as would be expected of her towards a pillar. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Kamado-sama." The boy looked taken aback. "Sam," he said. "You can call me Kamado-san. Better yet, call me Tanjiro, please." Then he turned to Shinobu. "You too, Shinobu-san." Shinobu blinked. She probably should have expected him to insist on being more familiar with everyone there. Somehow, that just seemed like him. She smiled wider, willing it to be more genuine than her normal smiles. She wasn't truly angry, just uncomfortable with him being around her little sister. Or any of the butterfly girls really. "Of course, Tanjiro-san." Then she glanced at Kanao. "Tanjiro-san and I were just heading back to the recovery wing. Could you inform AI for me?" The girl nodded and turned to walk away, almost mechanically, slipping her coin back into her pocket as she did so. "Kamado." "No." Tanjiro looked after her a little sadly. Shinobu decided it would be in everyone's best interest if she drew his attention away from her. "Tanjiro-san, this way. We do need to return to Suzuki-san's room before she wakes again." "Oh, right," the boy said with a firm nod. Shinobu cocked her head to one side, still smiling at him, and then turned to lead him down the hallway. They only spoke after that on what Tanjiro should say to her and what would likely help the most. She helped him bridge some gaps in his story and then they arrived. Thankfully, Suzuki-san was still unconscious. XXX. Genya looked down at the walls of the butterfly estate. It was built in a small valley and hidden by hills surrounding it, and yet it looked so open and welcoming. It hadn't been a difficult trek. These weren't tall mountains like he'd seen in the north, but nothing to really scoff at either. He and Sensei would reach there by nightfall at their current pace. "Genya." The boy looked up at his mentor. He seemed so tall, like a giant, and so solid, dependable, like his breathing style. Not fast and kind of flighty like Sanmi used to. No, he shouldn't think of that. He wouldn't. He shook his head and responded. "Yes, Sensei. I need your promise that you will not attack Kamado-san until we have proof of wrongdoing. He is a formidable opponent and we will need all of the Hashira's support if we find something must be done." Genya grit his teeth. The moment he saw this demon, he wanted to put a bullet through his neck. Or several, and maybe all of his knives. And the sword. He did still have his Nichiren sword, after all, even if he didn't use it all that often. Or, maybe it would be a good idea to just avoid the guy altogether and let Sensei look into it more. No, this was his brother and thus his mess to clean up. He wouldn't just leave that to other people. "Genya." The boy withheld a sigh. "Yes, Sensei," he said. "I promise." The man put a hand on his shoulder. "We cannot act without a plan." "I know," he replied. It still sucked, and they both knew it. They stood there for another minute or so before Hajime-sensei turned and frowned. "Someone else is coming," he said. Surprised, Genya turned and looked at the empty road behind them. Even after watching it for several seconds, no one came into view. He frowned up at his sensei, wondering yet again how he seemed to know the world around him without being able to see. "Sensei." Hajime-sensei held up a hand, then pulled out his beads and put his hands together, beginning a mantra again. It wasn't one Genya knew, but then he'd only memorized a couple himself. He hadn't told his sensei, but to him it felt wrong to say such sacred things when he ate demons to gain their powers to fight. A couple of seconds later, movement caught his eye. Squinting, he saw a figure come into view, racing towards them, chest bare but with a boar head. Demon? Genya asked. No, sensei said. Another demon slayer. Oh, right. He remembered seeing that guy at the final selection. It took Genya a couple more seconds to see the limp figure across his back, despite the blinding yellow hair the second boy had. Hadn't the kid been the one to talk to? Oh. And behind that, he saw a girl on their heels, running after them with her pink hurried flowing out behind her along with her long, black hair. She'd been laying on the demon's leg, he remembered. She knew him. He grit his teeth. What were they doing here? And why were they using their breath forms so obviously? Do you know them, Genya? Sensei asked, turning his head as if to look down at him. The younger man let out a breath, making sure to keep himself calm. They were all at my final selection, sensei. I think the girl is related to Kamado. I'm not sure about the others, although they had seemed close. Well, the yellow-haired kid had. It didn't take long for the trio to catch up to them and completely pass them by. Out of my way. I gotta win this and prove I'm the best boss. The boy with the boar's head yelled. Genya stepped out of the way just in time. He had no doubt he would have otherwise gotten bowled over by the maniac on his way past. The yellow-haired boy's head just sort of flopped on his shoulder, eyes rolled back. Then the girl came by and she shot them a smile. She launched herself into the air, flipped up and over, facing them as she fell back down all while bowing. In midair, Hashira-sama, Genya-san, she said. Pleased to see you. She landed in a bow that turned into a crouch, which she used to twist back around and launch herself down the path away from them, trailing after the boys. Genya blinked. What had that been? They sat there for several seconds, watching the trio head towards the butterfly estate, leaving only a trail of dust and some very confused fellow demon slayers in their wake. He wasn't even sure the yellow-haired boy was alive the way he looked, but he hadn't seemed dead either. I believe this will make our mission either far easier or far more difficult than we thought, Hajime-sensei said, tears rolling down his cheeks. Again, then he began in on some more mantras. One of them asked for luck and likely one asking for safety and help in. Was there one for sanity? He hoped so. Genya just nodded along because he agreed with whatever his sensei was praying for. Somehow, he couldn't help but think they'd need as much help as they could get. Kaio registered the dull throb in the back of her neck and head first. Ouch. She pried her eyes open and saw the white-walled room with wooden floors and oh, no. Adrenaline shot through her and she flailed for a moment, trying to push herself onto her hands and knees, and then hopefully she could get out of bed and get out of here and oh, good. You're awake. She froze, terrified to find the same young woman there as before as she slowly lifted her head up to see a boy instead. He couldn't be older than 14, with red-brown hair and a wide smile that showed no teeth. He also had his eyes closed. Even then, he looked so friendly. Then she noted his black outfit, just like the woman's had been, and the apprentice's under a green and black checkered hurried. She jerked away from him. Best stay away from me. She began to look around for something to use to defend herself. What's wrong? You all kidnapped me. That had to be it. That's the only thing that made sense. I don't know what you want with me but Suzuki-san, the boy said, voice somber. She whipped her head up to see him looking directly at her and her breath caught in her chest, as if her lungs simply refused to work, because his eyes glowed a bright red and they had kanji written in them. Waxing zero, a waxing moon, one of the elites, and she knew it down to her very bones. She didn't know what was worse, the realization that her memories were indeed real, and that she could not deny it any longer, or the fact that one of the strongest demons in existence stood before her. Her mouth wouldn't work and her jaw sort of just flapped up and down. She was shaking and couldn't stop, but couldn't make herself move other than that either. Then he opened his mouth and she saw further proof because he had huge canines that no human would ever have. Shinobu-san didn't lie to you. She couldn't blink or look away, and her cheeks were wet. She always hated the ticklish feeling of tears dripping down her skin, but could find no will to move her hand to wipe them away. She could only clutch at the smooth, white linens on the bed, her thoughts in a muddled mess of anguish, terror, and sickness. Eventually, he sighed and dragged the stool he'd been sitting on closer to her. She still couldn't find it in her to move back. It would do no good. She also knew that with every fiber of her being, if this boy wanted her dead, she would be. There was nothing she could do about that. The helplessness undermining everything else made the whole situation infinitely worse. My story is a pretty long one, he said with a sigh. and I can't tell you all of it, but I hope what I can tell you about it helps. My name is T-tanjiro. I was born on a mountain and lived there happily with my family for 13 years. We weren't rich, but we didn't really care. Then he came along. Kibutsuji Musen. Her eyes widened again. He'd said that name, the full name, and he wasn't dying. That seemed so wrong. She still didn't speak as Kamado continued. Due to some foresight, I was able to send my family away before he got there, and distracted him enough to catch his attention so that he turned me into a demon. Those first few memories I have after. He stiffened, closed his eyes and shuddered. For the first time Kaio felt as if she could move, as if she were actually safer than she realized. Oh, this being was dangerous, sure, but somehow she didn't think he meant her any harm. Which made absolutely no sense. But she wasn't in the right state of mind to think further into that. Slowly, warily, she moved her stiff and already sore arms, shifting herself so she sat up in bed, eyes still glued to the boy as he didn't even acknowledge her moving. What a relief. I killed them, you know. The family I was staying with at the time. They were my family and certainly just as close as my siblings and mother and... He closed his eyes again and covered his mouth with one clawed hand. Then he looked away, shamed and sickened. Kaio could relate. She hated that she could relate. Fortunately, I came around in time to stop myself from devouring my younger siblings. Even then, it was still so hard. I've only recently stopped drooling when around humans. But stopping myself was the single most physically difficult thing I've ever had to do in my life. A sigh and his eyes looked so sad. That's what he does, you know. He takes away any good sense and reduces his victims into little more than animals with the potential for higher thought. Newly turned demons have little to no conscience, and that hunger is so overwhelming. He put a hand on his stomach, still not meeting her gaze. His mouth had flattened into a grim line. For several seconds, he didn't speak and they sat there in a tense silence until Kaio finally decided to break it. Her shaking voice hoarse and rough. And waxing zero, she asked. He snorted. I rose through the ranks quickly. I suppose I ate more than I realized to begin with, or maybe it's because I sleep to gain energy and doing so constantly gave me consistent growth. I don't know, but I eventually got the strength I needed to challenge a waxing moon. I was hoping if I got information on them, then I could give it to the Demon Slayer Corps, and even if they wouldn't work with me, they could at least use that to take Musen out. But he caught me and was so amused at me and how I wanted to walk in the sun again, and he thought I could do it. He made an entirely new rank for me. He took another deep, calming breath before looking up at her. I spent that time trying to throw off his connection, his curse, instead of learning to walk in the sun. Eventually I succeeded, and then I took my information to the Corps as I had initially intended. Many people are still wary at my presence in the Corps, but Oyakata-sama gave me a chance, and for that I will be forever grateful. He faded off, a warm smile coming onto his face. So now, you fight other demons? Kaio asked, incredulous. He nodded and his smile turned melancholy. I've been trying to find a cure. Understanding began to click into place. For yourself. He opened his mouth, then paused and closed it for a moment before opening it again. I suppose so, to an extent. In any case, my blood art allows me to make fire and control it, or control what it burns. So I can burn a poison out of someone. Or the demon out of someone. Oh, you healed me, she said, almost whispering and not entirely sure of what she should think of that. He nodded. I'd tried before, but he died. I'm happy you didn't. Her thoughts and feelings began to coalesce and she honestly had just one question on her mind. Why couldn't you just kill me? He seemed taken aback by that. But the pain in her chest that had nothing to do with her breathing just kept growing with every connection her mind made. Every realization. Excuse me. He choked. She took a deep, shuddering breath. I killed him. She let out a sob, more tears streaming out of her eyes. Ezium, my dear, sweet Ezium. I killed him and I. A clawed hand suddenly covered the one of hers that remained in her lap and she looked up to see those glowing eyes that looked so kind. I know, he said softly, and she believed him, after everything he'd said. But what about your girls? Shinobu-san said you had 2 of them. She swallowed hard and shook her head, more sobs breaking free anyway. I've been a demon for 40 years. My daughters are older than I remember being, if they are even still alive. Her heart hurt so much. Her children had had to grow up without parents. How had they fared? How much had Kaio missed out on? All for a miracle cure that would save her life. She never should have accepted that offer. All of my family, she realized, her voice coming out breathy. Her parents, her husband's parents, her brothers and sisters. She looked up at Kamado's eyes again, tears blurring her vision and making it difficult to see the details of his face. I have no one left. No one. She had died 40 years ago. Her life had effectively ended. She didn't know what she expected from the boy. Exasperation, frustration, more consoling words. What she got was 2 warm arms coming to wrap around her. "I am so sorry," he whispered. She felt herself sob again and again, and then a mournful cry escaped her and she found herself rocking back and forth in his arms as she cried and screamed her pain out. She'd become a monster and because of it, had lost absolutely everything. She didn't know how long she sat there crying, but he never let go, although she felt he would if she would have pushed him away. He didn't even know her. Eventually, her tears slowed and then stopped, leaving her feeling empty, wrung out and dejected. Maybe a little lighter, but nothing compared to the prospect of what she had lost, and her future. She had no idea what she would do now, what she could do. It was a terrifying prospect. Overwhelming didn't begin to describe it and she was just so tired. She didn't want to talk anymore, so she didn't. He still didn't leave. He didn't speak either, just sitting there in silent support. What a remarkable boy. How could someone so kind and generous be a demon? Be a waxing moon? It was funny, she felt so much safer in this demon's presence than she had in any of the humans' presences she'd met since she'd woken up. Eventually, her eyelids began to droop and she fell back into a deep sleep, driven there by her mental, physical and emotional exhaustion. The last image she remembered before oblivion took her was of the boy's sad, but smiling face looking down at her. XXX. That went rather well, Shinobu said as Tanjiro quietly closed the door and stepped into the hallway. The boy sighed. "I don't know if I'd say well." He shook his head and just stared at the door as if he could see through it. "She's so hurt, and lost, and broken, and I know exactly how she feels." Shinobu frowned at that. "You've mentioned that before. You said in your earlier lives, you became a demon and remembered very little." He closed his eyes, as if bracing himself, and she almost regretted asking. "You can't understand the hunger of a demon until you've experienced it," he muttered. "It literally overpowers your mind and all you can do is act on instinct. The only person I know who could break through that was my sister. And even then, she was still wild, growling and thrashing like an animal." He snorted in a sort of sad but wry amusement. "I think Musen likes doing that to people, watching them revert to base instincts, then kill and eat the ones they love. He gets some sick, perverse pleasure out of it." He sighed. "Sadistic psychopath." Shinobu frowned, having not heard those words before. She opened her mouth to ask after them when a shriek caused them both to whip their heads around. Exchanging a glance, they turned and sprinted down the hallway. The sounds came from the front entrance and Shinobu got there first. A bare-chested boy with a boar's mask, of all things, over his head stood inside the open doorway. No, not open. Shinobu realized as she saw the door had been broken and pieces littered everywhere. On top of them lay a yellow-haired boy whose eyes had rolled into the back of his head, although he seemed to be breathing at least. AI stood right behind them, looking about ready to murder the bare-chested boy, who was paying no attention to her. A poor choice, in her opinion. No, he was focused on yelling at another demon slayer, a long-haired girl in a pink haori. The ends of her otherwise jet-black hair had faded to a rust color. "I got inside the house first. I'm the boss, and I'm the best boss. I totally won." The girl just smiled at him, eyes closing in emphasis. "But I reached the manor first. I technically win your challenge." Oh, Shinobu knew who that was right away. This should prove interesting. "No, I was ahead the whole time. You just pulled ahead at the last second." The girl's expression didn't change and she just nodded. "That was my strategy. If I would have pushed myself the hardest all the way, I wouldn't have been able to put on that last burst of speed." "AARG," the pig-headed boy yelled, stomping around and generally throwing a tantrum. "Master, I don't know what to do with him." AI practically growled as she stomped up to Shinobu, fire in her eyes. In the background, the other girl finally frowned disapprovingly at the boar-headed boy. "You shouldn't have broken their door, Inosuke-kun. That was incredibly rude of you. And you changed the goal. That's not fair." The boy practically froze. "You should apologize to the head of the estate and fix the door in amends." The Kamado girl crossed her arms and shook her head in disappointment. But, no, I quote am the boss. I quote am the best. You should fix the door." "But I didn't break it," she said. "If you ask nicely, maybe I can help you." She cut off as beside Shinobu, she heard Tanjiro chuckle. "That's Nezuko." The girl's eyes found them and then her whole face lit up. "And I-san," she shrieked and rushed forward, throwing her arms around her brother. "Nezuko," he said back, opening his arms and catching her, a grin of pure sunshine on his face. His sister smiled and took a step back, ignoring the boar-headed boy in the background, still yelling at her. The girl's face fell almost immediately. "Your eyes." "Oh, Nai-san," she said softly, putting a hand to his cheek. He smiled sadly. "It was this or die." or let someone else die. Gai-san, she said again, so quietly Shinobu wondered how anyone could hear it over the continuing yelling of the boar-headed boy. The insect pillar rubbed the bridge of her nose. This needed addressing. She let out some of her warrior's spirit and only let her smile look about half as real as it usually did. "Excuse me, Boar-san," she said, stepping forward. "Can you explain why you decided to barge into my house, break my door and harass my assistant?" The boy stopped speaking again, seemed to look Shinobu up and down, as if sizing her up. Then he took out his sword and yelled, "Fight me." Shinobu was reaching the end of her patience. "Inosuke," Nezuko yelled and stomped up to him. Then her hand moved, very quickly, and whacked him over the head. Shinobu could hear the thwap sound it made. "You can't fight other demon slayers." "Oh," he yelped. Then he turned to Nezuko and roared wordlessly. Before this could escalate any farther, Shinobu found herself jumping as quickly as she could behind the boy and going in for her second neck chop that day. She made sure to use extra speed so she could get enough momentum to hit the pressure point through the mask. He collapsed on the ground next to the yellow-haired boy. Nezuko sighed and bowed to her. "I apologize on his behalf. He was raised by boars, so I do not think he knows much better. I thought he'd started to act differently more recently." Shinobu just smiled down at her. "My name is Kacho Shinobu, the insect pillar. And you are?" "Oh," the girl exclaimed, one hand coming to cover her mouth before she hurriedly bowed again. "Kamado Nezuko, Kamado Tanjiro's sister. Pleased to meet you, Shinobu-san." She had absolutely no doubt they were siblings. She just nodded. "Well, I'm sure you have some catching up to do with your brother. But I need to help fix this," she protested, gesturing to the very messy entryway. "Did you destroy it?" Shinobu asked. Nezuko paused. "Well, no. But I was part of the wager that spurred him to." She gestured to the unconscious boys this time. "I see." The older woman made a show of thinking about it. "Well, I do think you had a point about modifying the goal. He initially lost because you successfully out-strategized him, correct?" The girl blushed a little and looked down. "It wasn't anything big. Just simple. You still analyzed the situation and adjusted it. He threw a tantrum because he didn't win." "I think it's more complicated than that," she protested weakly. "Perhaps, but that sort of behavior should not be rewarded. And so he will fix it on his own." She smiled again, thinking that would win the girl over. She really should have known better. "I don't think he knows how to fix a door," the younger demon slayer replied. "Like I said, I don't think he grew up living in a house." "He didn't," Tanjiro said in agreement. "And I'd be happy to help too." This was going nowhere fast. "If worse comes to worst, I'll help him and show him how to fix the door," Shinobu insisted. She knew she would have to be on top of this one from the get-go. The two siblings' eyes widened. "You shouldn't need to do that," Tanjiro protested. "Yeah, you're a pillar." Shinobu's eyes rose in amusement. "So is your brother," she said to the girl. They were going to argue some more, she could tell, so she held her hand up and they both closed their mouths. "I know you two have been looking forward to seeing each other. Go speak for a while. I will have one of the girls come and find you for dinner." She paused, then looked at Tanjiro. "Will you be joining us?" "Sure," he returned, smile grateful. She wasn't quite sure why he looked grateful. "Just because I can't eat doesn't mean I can't be there." The insect pillar nodded and smiled. "Then run along," she insisted. She could actually use a little break away from everyone and she needed to assess the two unconscious boys laying across her threshold anyway. The two siblings looked at each other for a second, and then they bowed as one. They really were so similar. "Thank you, Shinobu-san," they said simultaneously. Then the girl looked over at her brother excitedly. "I would like to show you my new vine style, Nai-chan." He looked utterly delighted. "You finished it already?" She shook her head. "I don't think so, but I'm close. I still think I can do more with it though. Maybe you'll have some ideas." "I can't wait to see it. Let me show you the practice yard." They turned and began to hurry off, but before they got far, Nezuko stopped and looked back at Shinobu and a still fuming AI. "Oh, we passed some other demon slayers on the road not too far away from here. They should arrive soon. I'm pretty sure one of them is a Hashira. That would be Haimjima-san and likely Shinazugawa Genya." "Thank you for letting me know, Nezuko-san," she said. The girl just grinned the signature Kamado smile. Then the two siblings continued on their way around the side of the house. Shinobu sighed and looked back at her butterfly estate and the broken, almost shattered, door. With another Shinazugawa coming, she somehow got the feeling that the mess in front of her wouldn't be the only pile of broken wood that once belonged to her home by the end of the night. Perhaps she could go and intercept them so she could set some ground rules. She wanted to make sure she still had an estate by the morning. She also got the feeling she wouldn't be getting any sleep tonight either. "Great. AI," she said with a sigh, "stop picking everything up and take the yellow one to a recovery room. Our pig friend here should wake up shortly and I'd like to have a talk with him." Half an hour later, the Komodo siblings came back, chattering excitedly, looking for some water to drink. Tanjiro couldn't stop bragging about how amazing his sister's new style was. They both stopped when they saw Nezuko hard at work, cleaning up even with no insect pillar in sight to keep an eye on him. Nezuko froze and blanched a little. Shinobu had gotten Nezuko to work. Like that. Quietly. That was the first time Nezuko really understood how dangerous Kacho Shinobu could be. Shinobu decided against going to intercept Himejima and Shinazugawa. With the new demon slayers on the property, she just felt that leaving would be tempting fate, and so she busied herself with her other duties. She did still have other patients after all, and the Kakashi to look after. She was more than a little relieved when, a little over an hour after they arrived, the Komodo siblings sought her out and Tanjiro asked if she would be willing to let him back into the cellar to sleep. She gladly did so, if only to avoid confrontations. His sister followed them to the cellar door, her face set in a grim line. She was apparently not happy about her brother going to sleep, and her expression fell further into a disapproving scowl when she saw the large, iron door that guarded the stairwell. Tanjiro apologized for not being able to make it to dinner after all, but he didn't want to risk not listening to his body, and his body said to sleep. He bid her a warm farewell with a hug and then smiled and bowed at Shinobu before heading down into the darkness, not seeming to care that the door locked behind him. Does it really have to be like this? Nezuko asked her quietly once the insect pillar put the keys in her pocket. Shinobu glanced at the girl now glaring at her determinedly, almost accusingly, and sighed. I trust your brother, more than I should, and more than you probably realize. The other one, though. She shook her head. I can't trust him. Not yet. But your brother can control him to an extent. That is the biggest reason why I want him down there when he rests. I need to do what I can to protect the rest of my household, no matter how difficult or how I may not like it. I see, the girl replied quietly. She wasn't happy about it, but she seemed to accept it. Would you like to see your friends? Shinobu asked, blatantly changing the topic. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the girl perk up. Yes, please. This way, the older teen said and began to head towards the recovery rooms. Not more than a hallway away, someone began to shout. Where am I? What is going on? Where is Nezuko? INNOOSUKE? Nezuko sighed. Shinobu felt her eye twitch. Or maybe she'd just burn the entire place down herself and be done with it. XXX. Not long after Shinobu left Nezuko with her weeping friend and had AI lead the boar-headed boy to them as well, Himejima and Shinazugawa knocked on the front gate. Politely, as one would expect, Shinobu gladly answered it and welcomed her fellow Hashira in before greeting his student, disciple. She was pretty sure Shinazugawa wasn't his Tsuguko, as she'd been the one to diagnose the heart problem he had that would prevent him from using breath forms. He could breathe just fine and would likely not have any serious problems fighting. But the slight irregularity of his heartbeat would prevent the even distribution of oxygen at maximum capacity. He could even seriously damage his body if he tried. Still, he seemed determined and was definitely learning from Himejima-san, so she settled on disciple until informed otherwise. The stone Hashira was calm, collected and steady as usual, and Shinazugawa seemed brusque but polite, rough around the edges, and obviously carrying his family's infamous anger, but he kept it in check admirably. She still reminded them that unless they were sparring or training, which certain areas were set aside for, there were to be no altercations between fellow demon slayers. Then she reiterated that they were all welcome and would show them to their room personally. All in all, it went smoothly and she went to dinner that evening feeling more hopeful about the entire situation. XXX. Dinner was tense. Nezuko wasn't entirely sure why, but the newcomers seemed wary, especially towards her. She couldn't help but think it had something to do with Tanjiro, which put her on her defense to a point where even Zenitsu and Inosuke avoided trying to set her off. That, honestly, just annoyed her more because she was fine. Thank you very much. Maybe a little protective of her now fully demon brother, but what did they expect? No, she knew the answer to that. They expected him to be evil and for her to try and kill him. She couldn't even be angry at that due to the sheer ridiculousness of it. In any case, the boy who came with the new Hashira, Genya-san, just wouldn't stop glaring at her. She recognized him from the final selection, and remembered he'd been rather angry and loud, but didn't know much about him other than his name. She did her best to ignore him, eating her meal calmly as the evening wore on. Once most of the large group currently inhabiting the estate finished, she offered to help AI and the three younger girls clean up. They gladly accepted and she was able to slip away from the harsh stares. Zenitsu looked like he wanted to come along, but Inosuke dragged him outside to spar, as apparently he'd promised a fight once they finished dinner. Nezuko was pretty sure Inosuke was exaggerating, but Zenitsu needed to continue to gain confidence, and the sparring would likely help. So she just waved as he wailed and reached for her, trying to escape their other friend as he marched through the door, refusing to release his iron grip on their yellow-haired companion's Haori. Many hands make light work, and she and the girls finished the chores quickly, at which point, Nezuko calmly made her way outside, hoping that she might be able to get in on some of the sparring. Unfortunately, she ran into the one person she'd been avoiding. "You," he hissed the moment he saw her. Nezuko felt her face fall and put one foot back, preparing to defend if she was attacked. Then she decided to try and play nice. It was the least she owed Shinobu-san, and it's what Tanjiro would want. "Hello, Shinazugawa-san," she said happily, even bowing a little. He ignored her words, instead rudely pointing at her. "Where is your demon brother?" Her expression cooled significantly. "Why do you want to know?" To her surprise, he stopped short and blinked, as if he didn't have an answer for that. "Just tell me," he finally settled on. Oh, so she was dealing with another child, not a teenager. Were these the types of boys the Demon Slayer Corps attracted? She'd expected people more like, well, the stoic samurais of old, she supposed. Like Tomioka-san, maybe also Himejima-san, but they were definitely the exceptions. "Ask Shinobu-san," she replied. "If you need to know, she'll be happy to tell you." She went to walk past him. "I'm not sleeping in an estate with a demon." Well, 2 demons actually, but she wasn't about to say that. There was standing up for herself, and then there was provoking the other party. She refused to sink that low. "He's locked away and safe from you," she said, rolling her eyes as she finally passed him. Then his arm shot out towards her, likely to pin her to the wall or hit her, and she had to duck and roll to avoid it. Out of instinct, she came up facing him, hand resting on her sword. He looked surprised for several seconds, and then he turned to glare at her. "We're the ones that need to be safe from him." Nezuko couldn't help that she scoffed and rolled her eyes again as she straightened up. "It's obvious you have no idea what you're talking about." "Why you?" he growled and started towards her. Genya, a calm, deep voice made him stop in his tracks, and Nezuko glanced past him to the large, blind man who had just turned into the hallway. "You need to calm down. Recite a mantra." The boy looked pained for a second before sighing and beginning to speak under his breath. "My apologies for my student," the stone Hashira said to Nezuko with a nod of his head. She immediately felt herself relax a little and was able to give him a bright smile. "Thank you, Himejima-san." He returned her smile with another polite nod. It seemed he favored a stoic expression. "May I ask if you have seen your brother since you arrived?" Nezuko frowned a little, not liking that they wanted to know about Tanjiro, but she also wanted to help them trust him, so she nodded, albeit a little reluctantly. "I have." The older man frowned thoughtfully. Did he act differently than normal? She still felt uneasy at his line of questioning, but again, felt she should simply answer truthfully. "Not really. I mean, he's sleeping more than I thought he would." That seemed to take the man aback. "Sleeping?" he asked. She nodded. "That's how he gets his energy in place of eating." "I'm not sure exactly how that works, but he seems to need a great deal of sleep to make up for the food he's missing." Shinazugawa snorted, but didn't stop speaking under his breath, nor did he look at her. She shot him a glare before turning her wide eyes back up at the Hashira. "So," the man said slowly, "he can no longer eat human food." Nezuko frowned. Wasn't it public knowledge? He hasn't been able to since he fought the 2 waxing moons to save mine and Kenroji-san's lives. That was, she paused and thought about it, several weeks ago. A couple of months, actually, and he hasn't tasted any human flesh since then. This was getting tiring, but she forged ahead with a huge smile. "Nope, he's been with other Hashira the entire time, so you can ask them to confirm it." Besides, she couldn't think of a scenario that would make her brother eat humans. "Did you know he has turned a human into a demon?" the Hashira asked. Nezuko tensed at that because she hadn't known that. She knew he had a new demon on his side, but she thought that had been like Akatsuki-san. "No," she finally replied slowly. "Well, he did," Shinazugawa said, turning to her with a glower on his face, "and he was my brother." Nezuko gasped softly. "Oh, that explained a lot." "I'm sure he had a good reason," she said, hating how unsure she sounded. "No, there is no good reason. Seimi would rather die than become a demon." Nezuko felt her hackles raise as she glared at the boy. "Naisen's demons aren't like Musen's demons. A demon is a demon," he shouted back. Her expression dried out and she folded her arms. "Funny, I've never seen any of Musen's demons avoid eating by sleeping." "And you've seen one of Kamato's do that?" Himejima asked. Nezuko nodded. "Yes, Akatsuki-san does that now." The larger man frowned. Nezuko didn't know if that was because he'd forgotten or because he hadn't expected her to remember that. Or maybe it was another reason. He was not an easy person to read. You can say that because your only living sibling wasn't turned into the thing he hates the most, Shinazugawa said, still angry, and he seemed to have tears running down his cheeks now. Actually, so did Hajime-san as he put a calming hand on his student's shoulder. They caused her anger to calm a little. These men were hurting. She didn't need to add to that. No, she replied softly, only my oldest one. That seemed to take Shinazugawa back. The Hashira just looked skeptical. He hated the idea of becoming a demon. She continued, looking down as she remembered the fear on her brother's face as he woke that morning 2.5 years ago. He didn't want me to see, but I knew it scared him, terrified him. He wanted to stay human and would do anything to have a human life again. That isn't possible, Hajime-san said, his voice quiet and pitying. Nezuko shook her head. It is. People are working on cures right now. He even saved a demon by burning the demon cells out of her. She's human again. She smiled at them, but then frowned sadly after a moment. Although another demon died when he tried the first time, so it's still not a guarantee. Tanjiro had been so sad when he'd told her that, and so excited when he'd spoken of his success. He really took too much on his shoulders. The two men in front of her stared at her in shock. Well, Shinazugawa stared in shock. Hajime-san still managed to look stunned though. Then why can't he burn the demon cells out of Sanmi? The angry boy asked. Nezuko opened her mouth, but then closed it slowly as she tipped her head to the side and thought. There wasn't any reason as far as she knew. I don't know if he can or not, she finally replied, then forced a smile. You should ask him when you see him. I'm sure he'd be happy to help. The boy looked torn between being hopeful and wanting to lunge at her again. However, the larger man's arm held him back. Thank you for speaking with us, Hajime-san said with a shallow but respectful bow. The tears on his cheeks glistened in the fading light of the hallway. We apologize for taking your time. That's okay, she assured them. Then she glanced at Shinazugawa. When strange things started happening to my brother, I wanted to know what was going on too. I hope Nyai-san can burn the demon cells out of your brother. The boy didn't seem to know what to make of that, so he just stood there as she bowed respectfully to them. Please excuse me. I was on my way to the training ground to meet my friends. Have a pleasant night. You too, Hajime-san replied as she turned and continued on her way. Only once she knew they could no longer see her did she relax. That had not been pleasant, and now she had questions for her brother as well. He'd turned a human into a demon. He could do that. Tameo-san hadn't said anything about that. But Nezuko trusted Tanjiro. She trusted him with all her heart. He'd had a good reason. She just had to wait until he woke up before she could get the whole story out of him. Until then, it was useless to think on it. A couple of seconds later, she stepped onto the Ingawa and saw a flash of bright yellow as Zenitsu ran by, trailing tears and snot in his wake. Nezuko sighed. At least he was using his breath form. But he wasn't going as fast as she knew he could, which made his current levels a conscious choice, despite his panicked expression. He was thinking through his panic, so improvement. He was still participating in a spar, even if that meant he'd keep away from the bare-chested boy chasing him. Loudly, Nezuko cleared her throat. They both froze and turned to her. Nezuko-chan. He's so mean to me, Zenitsu cried as he suddenly sprinted behind her, putting her between him and the boar-headed boy. I gotta make my underlings strong. Inosuke yelled. We all gotta be the strongest so everyone will look up to us. At least he stopped before running into her. The yelling still didn't sound good right next to her ear, though. She sighed. Inosuke-san, are you still up for a spar? The boy drew back, probably surprised, but then she could practically feel the manic grin appearing on his face behind his mask. Fight me, Nezuko. She sighed, then turned and walked onto the field calmly, never drawing her sword and knowing Inosuke wouldn't attack her when she wasn't at her strongest unless he was trying to make a point. Once in the middle of the field, she turned and put her hand on her sword. With a loud, excited yell, Inosuke launched himself at her. Off to the side, Zenitsu started shouting, calling him names for daring to be so cruel to Nezuko-chan. She made a mental note to drag him into the yard next. After the interrogation she just had, she needed this release. XXX. Genya watched the girl leave, thoughts conflicted. She believed in her brother but wished the best for his. That made no sense. No, she had to be keeping the peace or buying time, no matter how sincere she'd sounded. He wanted to follow her and demand to know where her brother was again. Maybe if he could sneak up on him while he slept. Genya, the hand on his shoulder felt heavier than normal. You are not being rational. That girl is protecting her brother. She's protecting a demon. The younger Slayer practically hissed back, throwing his hand in the direction she'd disappeared in. As are many of the Hashira and Oyakata-sama, he said sternly. Hence why we have to be careful and find evidence. His frown deepened and he folded his arms, looming over Genya, likely without really meaning to. It was still intimidating. I certainly hope you weren't planning on just sneaking in and killing Kamado while he slept. Genya didn't answer, looking down guiltily. Not that Hajime-san could see, but he likely could tell his students' intentions from the silence alone. That would have gotten you kicked out of the corps, the larger man said with a tired sigh, and may have gotten you turned over to the police as they would handle a murder of a fellow demon slayer is just that, a murder, demon or not. That's if they didn't decide to execute you for such actions. And likely that girl would have been the one to execute you as you would have killed her brother. He killed mine. I have every right to avenge him. He didn't kill him. He turned your brother into a demon. That's as good as, worse even. Another tired sigh. I do not disagree with you, the man said. But that doesn't stop the fact that we have to tread carefully. You promised me you would not attack Kamado without any evidence. Despite that, you actively planned on going back on your word. Genya looked down again, hating the shame that bubbled in his chest. Sorry, sensei. The man just shook his head. Come along. I have more mantras for you to learn. It seems you need them more than I realized. Tomorrow, we will search for a waterfall to train under. The younger demon slayer didn't groan, but it was a near thing. He did wince. Hajime-san's punishments were memorable, which was likely the point. It irked Genya that he wouldn't be able to confront his brother's demon master, but he did trust in his teacher. He'd acted rashly, and now would have to deal with the consequences of his actions. Yes, sensei, he finally said, dejected. The older man nodded and turned to head back the way he'd come. Genya went to follow after him, shooting one last frustrated look over his shoulder at the empty hallway before sighing and rushing after his teacher. XXX. The next several days at the Butterfly Mansion were tense. Nezuko made sure to be polite to Hajime-san and Shinazugawa-san, and encouraged Inosuke and Zenitsu to be as well. Inosuke outright refused, but didn't treat them any differently than he would of any other demon slayer, constantly challenging them to fights or just outright ignoring them. Shinazugawa, in return, simply ignored Inosuke right back. Thankfully, he did much the same for her and Zenitsu, and while she still found it rude, it was better than starting outright fights. Hajime-san was, at least, calm and polite. He asked Shinobu-san several questions and the two of them would often spar, but other than that, there was little interaction between Hajime, Shinazugawa, and more or less everyone else. Nezuko actually enjoyed her time at the estate. Despite this, she trained often with Zenitsu, Inosuke, and Shinobu-san's Suguko, Kanao. Although, the latter only joined their group after Shinobu-san specifically asked her to, and while the girl didn't speak much, she was dedicated and strong. Nezuko found herself very much enjoying her training against the other girl. She also enjoyed her time interacting with the younger girls of the estate as it reminded her very much of her own siblings and went a long way to easing any discomfort she had regarding the entire situation. Still, the whole house seemed to be on edge, and she knew exactly what would tip it over into chaos, as did everyone else. Then, finally, almost a week after Nezuko had arrived at the estate, the demons in the cellar woke. Seimi's head felt heavy as he woke, and he was hungry, really hungry, famished even. When was the last time he ate? After several seconds, he opened his eyes to near darkness. He could still see a fair bit, though, and realized he was in a very plain, small room. He didn't really remember why, but he felt safe enough, so he simply yawned and stretched before sitting up and getting a better look. That was when he realized he wasn't alone. He slept against the back wall of the small room, but another figure on a futon took up the space in front of the door. He frowned. What? His mind, still fogged from sleep, didn't seem to want to work to make sense of the situation. Before he could begin to really try, though, the figure groaned sleepily and rolled over. Then, two small slits of red pierced the darkness. The wind pillar blinked, recognizing the bottom half of the kanji in those eyes. Seimi-san, a familiar voice asked slowly. You're awake. Seimi blinked again. How long had he been asleep? Then the boy's eyes opened fully and he sat up. You are. I'm relieved. Palm fire. Then the kid's hand lit up. Seimi couldn't stop himself from backing away from the display, half because demon fire, and half because the light wasn't comfortable on his eyes in the dark. Although, that didn't linger at least. Thankfully, Kamado must have noticed because he kept his burning hand well away from Seimi. How do you feel? The boy asked. Hungry, he replied, trying to remember how he'd gotten here and what was going on. Yeah, sorry about that. Why would he? Wait, I died, Seimi said as his memories started to come back to him. He'd been cut in half, and the only reason he'd lasted as long as he had was due to his control of the constant concentration breathing. He looked down at his body and found himself in a sleeping yukata. He pulled the garment open and searched his torso. Nothing, not even a scratch. All of his other scars were there, though. You almost did, the boy said softly, sadly. But Sanmi had other memories too. They were fuzzy. Of him jumping through trees and Shinobu and another woman he attacked, a demon. You told me I couldn't save you, Kamado went on, looking down at his still lit hand, but then he looked pointedly, almost pityingly, over at the older demon slayer. But I could. How? Sanmi asked. Then he cut off as the pieces began to come together in his mind. The boy winced and seemed to brace himself. Good thing, too, because the next thing Sanmi knew, he'd lunged at Kamado and punched him as hard as he could. The kid flew out the open door and crashed into the wall on the other side of the hallway. Sanmi hadn't realized that his punch would have that kind of force, but he brushed it aside, anger fueling him as the kid's fire went out and they were plunged into darkness again. Before Kamado could get up, Sanmi was there, grabbing him by the yukata and shoving him against the wall. His mind noted how much stronger he felt and how fluidly his body moved. He felt his very sharp fingernails digging into the palm of his hands through the yukata. But the worst was his tongue. It felt weird, stronger and longer and yet not coiled, as if ready to strike. Past very sharp teeth. Yeah, he decided he really didn't want to think about that right now. Or that cloying hunger that just gnawed at his gut. Nope, focusing on other things. Like the brat he held against the wall. The brat who looked up at the taller demon slayer both defiant and contrite. Sanmi had no idea how he managed to pull both of those off at once. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't let you die. You should have. He yelled, trying not to panic. At least I would have died human. The boy's eyebrows drew together and Sanmi felt the kid's breath catch. Do you really mean that? He asked quietly. The older man opened his mouth to say, yes, absolutely. But the words died in his throat. He remembered the heart-stopping moment when he'd fallen and seen his legs detached from his body. He remembered waxing one and how Kamado, who had taken on 4 Hashira at once, had been on the back foot in that fight. How he must have chosen to try and save Sanmi, despite everything. How the waxing moon had been screaming and shrieking in pain as the fire came to life around them. Had he killed waxing one? And did Sanmi really want to be left on that field? No, he really didn't. Were you in my place? Could you just sit by and watch a fellow demon slayer die when you could do something? The kid continued. Sanmi grit his teeth. In his mind, he came up with a billion curses for the brat in front of him. But he swallowed them down. Then he took a deep breath and released it before forcing himself to open his hands and take a step back. Because Kamado was right and Sanmi knew it. That didn't make him happy, nor did it make what happened good. No, that was still very, very wrong. But, angrily, he let out a yell and punched the wall right by Kamado's head. His hand literally crumbled the stone and cracks spider-webbed out from the point of contact. Kamado didn't move a muscle. They sat there in silence for several seconds, the only sound Sanmi's heavy breathing as he tried to come to terms with this new development. For what it's worth. And sorry, Kamado's quiet words finally broke the silence. Sanmi withheld a hysterical laugh. I don't want your apologies, he growled. But there was no heat to his words. He just felt. Well, he wasn't sure how he felt right now. Ashamed, frustrated, angry, understanding despite himself. Did it matter? How did we get here? Sanmi asked after a couple more seconds, raking his hands through his hair and looking around. They were in a hallway with a low ceiling. Along each wall, he could see a series of doors. It wasn't a terribly long hallway, with maybe 8 doors altogether and then a stairwell leading up. Where are we, even? Something in the back of his mind said he knew the answer, but he didn't really want to examine much of anything right now. We're at the butterfly estate, Kamado explained cautiously. A weight lifted from Sanmi's shoulders, but at the same time he wanted to groan. He didn't want anyone else to see him like, well, this. But knowing where he was and that other pillars were around was relieving. If things got out of hand, if this ever-present and utterly maddening hunger got the better of him. Speaking of, he felt himself go a little pale. This isn't the first time I've been awake, is it? He ventured cautiously. It wasn't a question. Kamado didn't answer for a second, but finally shook his head as he eyed Sanmi warily. The wind pillar didn't want to ask his next question, but he had to. He had to know. He turned away from the teen. If he didn't look, it might make this easier. Did I attack anyone? He asked. His arms shook at his sides. He clenched his fists so tightly. You have not eaten or even attacked a human. You did have the opportunity, but I tried to keep you in check. It worked. Sanmi glared at the kid over his shoulder. What do you mean? You kept me in check. Kamado rubbed the back of his head uncomfortably. I have some control over you, like I do Akatsugi, and I can sense your, emotions. Health, yeah. Oh, Sanmi did not like that. What? He hissed, turning around and feeling his fingers stretch out then curl. He didn't like that instinct either, but decided to focus on one problem at a time. Right now, his gaze was locked on Kamado, who held his hands up placatingly. I don't want it. I hate it. But there isn't anything I can actually do about it except try not to do anything about it. An animalistic growl that he supremely hated worked its way up Sanmi's throat. Kamado took a deep breath and forced a smile. At least you can go out in the sun. Sanmi just stared at him because did he really think that something like that would make up for turning him into a monster? But attacking the kid wouldn't do any good. He knew Kamado had made a hard decision, and even as angry as Sanmi was, he could still understand that. He just couldn't stand to look at the kid right now, and those instincts that urged him to attack were almost as difficult to ignore as the hunger. So, instead, he turned and stomped back into the small room cell. It was a cell for holding demons he recognized now, and stopped only once he stood on the futon he'd woken up on. He stood there, facing the wall as his fingers flexed and stretched because as little as he wanted to think about his new status, it was a surprisingly soothing movement. He didn't know how long he stood there, focusing on his breathing and his fingers flexing. But eventually he felt like he could talk and move again without tearing something apart. Kamado showed some rather amazing brilliance by not drawing any attention to himself at all whatsoever. Eventually, Sanmi dropped into a crouch, his arms resting on his knees and head down. He did not like this turn of events at all, but, well, it was what he had to work with right now. The sooner he came to terms with that, the better. When he did speak, his voice croaked more than he would like, but he had more questions he wanted answers to. How do you handle it? Handle what? Kamado's ever calm, ever understanding voice replied. He must have come back in to sit on his own futon as his voice came from right behind the wind pillar. The hunger. There weren't even humans in the room right now, and Sanmi just wanted to consume. How could anyone overlook it? Brush it off. Ignore it. Kamado didn't answer for what felt like a very long time. Practice, I suppose, was his final answer. Sanmi snorted out a mirthless laugh. Practice, and I'll be here to stop you if it overrules you. That was more comforting than Sanmi wanted it to be. He took a deep breath. I have memories of attacking a woman, of eating her, but he couldn't bring himself to say that aloud. Yeah, that was a demon. Apparently we can eat demons just as much as we can eat humans. Go figure. The kid sounded bitter enough that Sanmi found himself looking over at the figure now leaning on the door frame, arms crossed and a sardonic expression on his face as he studied the packed dirt floor as if it held the secrets to the universe. I actually think, Kamado continued, not looking up, that jump-started your, well, growth, I suppose, for lack of a better word. Nezuko slept straight for 2 years and still couldn't really speak when she woke. Once she conquered the sun, she could say a couple of words. It took me a dozen loops of constantly being turned into a demon before I could overcome it enough to speak, and even then, I still needed dozens more to get to where I could think like normal. He finally looked up at Sanmi. Between what you ate and sleeping for, well, however long we've slept, a couple of weeks, I suppose, it helped you get to a point where you could think on a similar level to, well, before. Sanmi looked back at the wall in front of him. That didn't make him feel any better. Although, he was grateful he hadn't eaten a human. He wasn't sure he could forgive himself then. Oh, I was able to burn the demon out of her. Sanmi looked over his shoulder again. Who? What? The woman you attacked. Shinobu-san knocked her out with her poison and I successfully burned the demon cells out of her. She survived too. And there was the kid's usual sunshine smile. It felt odd, for some reason, that this was the first time since waking up that Sanmi had seen it. He didn't even know Kamado that well. That's great, he said, a little sarcastically. But I can't say I care too much unless you can burn the cells out of me, too. Kamado's smile faded, but then he looked thoughtful. I suppose I could try that. It never really occurred to me before. But I don't know if it would work. I mean, you saw what happened the first time. Sanmi winced. Yeah, he didn't exactly want to go out like that either. Still better than being a demon though. Look, before we decide anything, let's go talk to Shinobu-san. She'll want to know that you're awake anyway. That actually wasn't a bad idea, except he wasn't sure he trusted himself around humans right now. I'll make sure you don't hurt anyone, Kamado assured him. I promise. Sanmi didn't want to agree, but what else could he do? Hide away down here forever? Yeah, he was many things, but a coward wasn't one of them. Fine, he said, standing up. This was a bad idea, but it was better than anything else he could think of at the moment. Great. Kamado grinned. Come on. He hurried up the cramped stairwell and reached the top where a heavy, iron door blocked their path. To Sammy's surprise, the kid started pounding on it. A dull, metallic thump rang through the cellar. Can't you just break that down? He asked. Yeah, probably, Kamado replied nonchalantly. But it would scare the girls and probably Shinobu-san, and the last thing I want to do is make her angrier than she already is. Sammy snorted. Kid had a point. They stood there for several minutes as Kamado kept knocking before a muffled voice finally interrupted the steady thumps. Nyai-san. The kid perked up immediately. Nezuko. It's me. The muffled voice replied. I sent Sumi-san to get Shinobu-san. She's the only one who has keys. That's great, Nezuko. Thanks. How are you feeling? The girl asked. I'm great. Kamado responded brightly. Sammy rolled his eyes. Sammy-san and I just woke up, but it was a good sleep. Shinazugawa, Sammy muttered. Kamado glanced back at him. Really, it was a little weird to have someone who could probably tell everything he was feeling call him Shinazugawa, he had to admit. So he sighed. Sammy's fine, I guess, he grumbled. The kid just beamed at him. Sanmi. Oh, right. The girl on the other side said. That your sister? The older demon slayer asked, not really knowing what else to say. Yup, Kamado said with that grin of his. I'll introduce you when we get the door open. Oh, his smile suddenly turned sharp. If you try to hurt her in any way, I'll kill you myself. Nyai-san. The girl from the other side said, sounding exasperated. Sammy just matched Kamado's smile. Same for my brother, Kamado. The kid just nodded and turned back to the door. Oh, you can call me Tanjiro if I can call you Sammy. The older man sighed, smile dropping. Whatever, we're not friends. Tanjiro just shrugged. Of course we aren't. In my first life, you stabbed my sister and then cut yourself to try and get her killed, to prove her wrong. I kind of still haven't forgiven you for that. Sammy winced. He really hoped he never came across a Marechi. He already knew just being around humans in general wouldn't be easy, and they wouldn't even be bleeding. He almost felt bad knowing what kind of torture he'd put some demons through now with his blood. Almost. They were still demons and deserved it, after all. That didn't stop him from dreading the day when he may come across something like that. Right, he muttered. Nai-chan. The girl on the other side said, sounding even more exasperated than before. I can take care of myself. I bet I could then too. Of course you could. Tanjiro called back. Didn't stop me from getting angry. You'd be just as mad if someone did the same thing to me. She didn't answer for several seconds, but when she did, it was soft enough that Sanmi almost didn't hear it. True, a couple more seconds of silence fell over them before Nezuko spoke up loudly. Oh, Shinobu-san, thank you for coming. Another familiar voice answered. Of course, Sanmi winced. He really didn't want to face her. Or, well, anyone. Coward, he muttered to himself, even as he braced for the scent of humans. Kamado. Tanjiro turned to look at him worriedly as the sound of metal sliding into and hitting metal echoed from the lock. You're not a coward, he finally said. And if you don't want to do this now, I'll just tell Shinobu-san to. No, Sanmi shook his head. It had to happen sometime. May as well be now. It's fine. Are you sure? Kamado asked. Yes, the older demon replied. The sounds of keys in a keyhole stopped and Shinobu spoke up. Tanjiro-san, she said sweetly, is that Shinazugawa-san with you? The kid glanced back at Sanmi and took a deep breath of his own. Yes, he called. He's awake and actually lucid. Really? She sounded surprised. Right, she'd seen him as a demon before. That really just made this all worse. Yeah, I'm good, Kacho, he called. A pause, and then, I certainly hope so. If not, I'll be forced to kill you. He could just picture the smile on her face as she said that. It should have worried him or ticked him off, but it really just relieved him. Good, he said back. Another long pause, then the clicking of the keyhole continued and the heavy door swung open. Once again, the much brighter light of the estate had seen me looking away, but his eyes adjusted quickly. He expected to see two figures standing in the hall outside, but he only saw one. It didn't take long to recognize Kacho Shinobu in a ready position, hand on her sword. Both he and Kamado held up their hands in surrender. That didn't stop his mouth from watering. It wasn't terrible, at least. He wasn't drooling. Right about then, it hit him as to just how strong Kamado was. The kid only smiled at Shinobu and stepped aside so Sanmi could finish ascending the stairs. Nezuko, Kamado said. Back here, Nyai-san, she called from behind the open door that blocked part of the hall from view. I had to make sure, Shinobu said as she straightened, although she didn't take her hand from her sword. Sanmi approved. I'm good for now, he said, rubbing the back of his head in annoyance. As long as no one is bleeding, I guess. The insect Hashira tipped her head to one side. You think you'd lose control then? she asked curiously. Sanmi withheld a wince, but figured he needed to tell the truth. Yeah. Instead of making her more wary, she actually smiled at him, probably the most real smile he'd seen on her since Kenny. Thank you for being honest with me. I will keep that in mind. And you are to go nowhere in this house without myself, Tanjiro-san or Hajime-san for the foreseeable future. He nodded again. Yeah, I get it. Perhaps we should exchange notes and discuss what has happened so far, she said as she looked between Sanmi and Kamado. Can I come out now? Nezuko asked petulantly. Shinobu raised an eyebrow at Sanmi. Yeah, I'm good, he said again. She smiled at him, then looked over past the door. You may join us, Nezuko-chan, if you wouldn't mind shutting the door. Sure, the girl said. Sanmi and Kamado got out of the way as the iron door began to shut. A girl in a demon slayer's outfit and a pink Haori came into view as she pushed it closed. It shut with a loud clang and she straightened up, smiling almost as brightly as her brother. Then she bowed. Kamado Nezuko, she said. Pleased to meet you. Somehow, he doubted that. Shinazugawa Sanmi, he replied, bowing shallowly. Now, if you would follow me, we'll speak in my office, Shinobu said with that usual fake smile as she turned and began to head down the hallway. Sanmi fell into step behind her while Kamado and Nezuko began to whisper behind him as they, too, followed. They turned down another hallway, and then another, and Sanmi was beginning to wonder just how large the butterfly estate was when a figure turned into their hallway across from them. Shinobu froze and Sanmi had to stop himself from running into her. Behind him, the whispering stopped as well. The figure on the other side of the hallway stood stock still, eyes wide with fear and mouth agape, and Sanmi recognized him immediately. Genya. For several seconds, everyone in the hallway seemed frozen in time. No one seemed to want to break the tense silence. Aniki. The word seemed to slip out of the younger Shinazugawa's mouth without him noticing. And then Sanmi realized that he really didn't care about any tense silences. Aniki, just who is this Aniki? Cause it sure ain't me. I got no brother. Got it. Genya's eyes went wide and he backed away. What are you doing here? The wind pillar practically growled as he shoved past Shinobu. Shinazugawa, she hissed. He ignored her as he walked, stomped up to Genya. He expected the brat to back down again. Instead, the kid's expression firmed and he pulled a gun on him. Gasps sounded from behind them, and even Shinobu spoke up, admonishing. Shinazugawa-kun. Genya ignored them all. I've been trying to figure out how to apologize to you for calling you a murderer all those years ago. But now you're worse than a murderer. Sanmi blinked, trying to ignore how that stung. Did you actually work up the guts to try and kill me, without using a breathing form? This is why you should leave the Corps. You useless, good for nothing. Bang. The new demon felt a burn in his throat. He saw Genya take out a Nichiren sword and lunge at him, screaming. He had tears in his eyes, and then everything exploded into chaos. XXX. Gyomai was frustrated. He didn't let that show, and he refused to take that frustration out on anyone else, but his investigation into Kamado Tanjiro had gone nowhere. Quite literally, almost every question about his biology or personality that Shinobu or the girls who worked the estate answered seemed to work in the boy's favor, but none of it was proof. He couldn't find any evidence for or against his cause as a demon slayer. The fact that Shinobu seemed to have been completely converted to trusting Kamado helped, but she couldn't seem to articulate why she trusted him to Gyomai's satisfaction. It's the little things, she'd said. The way he acts, the things he remembers, what is important to him, how much he hates Muzan. But these were all things he couldn't actually know for himself because Kamado had been asleep for the past week, and apparently several days before that as well. Everyone else in the estate seemed to have a good opinion of him, if they had an opinion at all. And on top of it all, he knew Genya was reaching the end of his rope when it came to patience. If Gyomai didn't find something solid, either for or against Kamado, soon, he didn't regret taking Genya on as a student, despite his inability to use breath forms. He did lament the boy's rashness and hard-headed actions at times, though. He'd just finished some training with the boy, who had hurried ahead to take care of something Gyomai wasn't sure what, but suspected he would be looking for Kamado again. And if he found out that was indeed the truth, Genya would find himself pushing and pulling boulders simultaneously, which left the stone pillar to ponder what he should do about the situation. Should he take his student and leave? That would directly defy Yubayashiki-sama's orders, though. Or, well, the spirit of those orders. However, Genya was not in a good place right now, and he wasn't learning well either. He obviously didn't feel safe and he was obsessed with finding either his brother or Kamado. He may just have to write back to Yubayashiki-sama and insist that this was not a good idea. A sound reached his ears, breaking through his reverie, and bounced off of the world around him, giving him an excellent picture of his surroundings. He'd almost reached the front door to the estate, having just crossed through the gate that led into the courtyard. Wait, that wasn't just a small noise. That was many noises, and shouting, and a gunshot. And with that, he knew his student was at the heart of it. 2 minutes later, Jiaomai turned down a corridor and froze. The chaos he heard from so many different sources made getting a full picture very difficult. But after a few moments of concentration, he realized that Genya, the Kamado girl, and Shinobu-san were gathered nearer to him at this end of the hallway. At the other end, he sensed a struggling pair, Kamado and Shinazugawa, from the sounds of it. Jiaomai did not like the growls and snarls that came from those two as, from what he could tell, one tried to stop the other from attacking. Shinobu-san, he said loudly, what happened? Himejima-san, she said, almost breathlessly, and he heard her coming towards him. Your student, she practically spit the word. Oh, if she was showing her anger, this must be really bad. Shot his brother in the neck. Jiaomai blinked, taken aback. Was he provoked? Shinobu sighed in frustration. I can't say he wasn't after Shinazugawa-san told him they weren't brothers. Then Shinazugawa-kun told our ever-patient Wind Pillar. Her voice took on a derisive, sarcastic tone, that he'd become worse than a murderer. Pulled out his slaying gun and shot his not brother, I suppose. To be fair, Shinazugawa-san practically dared him to. What happened next? Shinazugawa-kun jumped at Shinazugawa-san with his sword out and tried to slice off his head. Unenhanced, mind you. Jiaomai didn't wince, but he did close his eyes and take out his prayer beads because that had been monumentally stupid and the situation most definitely called for it. The next thing I know, Shinazugawa-san is jumping at Shinazugawa-kun. So I and the Kamado siblings rushed in to try and get in the way, and now Nezuko-chan is holding back Shinazugawa-kun and Tanjiro-san is holding back Shinazugawa-san, and neither one of them will calm down. That certainly sounded about right, seeing as he kept hearing the Wind Pillar spitting vitriol and telling Genya that he wasn't good enough to be in the Corps and to just leave already. Unfortunately, Jiaomai's own student seemed intent on saying things just as bad back, about how Seinmi was a terrible older brother who abandoned the only family he had left and then let himself get turned into the very thing they're fighting against. Jiaomai had spoken to Genya about his temper before, and had even touched on some things that had happened in his past when the boy had been willing to speak about it. But for the most part, the Stone Pillar had wanted to stay out of it and not complicate things more than they already were. However, it seemed that the time for waiting for them to sort things out on their own had passed. Genya, he said sternly, that would likely be undermined by the tears streaming down his cheeks again. But the youth should be used to that by now at least. His voice seemed to break the boy out of his rage. But just to be safe, Jiaomai stepped between him and his brother. It seemed to work as his student stopped shouting. They stood there for several seconds while Seinmi kept yelling behind them. You promised, Jiaomai said quietly but firmly, putting all of his frustration and disappointment into those words. But, sensei, he started, although he must have realized he wouldn't be able to give a decent reason or argument because he faded off and didn't continue. Then, behind him, Kamado shouted, I know you don't want him to fight because you want him to stay safe. You want him to live and have the good life you don't think you'll ever be able to have. I get it, but this isn't the way to help him. In the long run, you're hurting him more than Muzan ever could. That shut Seinmi up, and everyone else too. Finally, the Wind Pillar growled out, what was that? Threateningly, Kamado snarled back, and Jiaomai figured that was a demon's way of asserting dominance or defiance because Shinazugawa didn't say anything afterwards. Seemingly satisfied, the kid went on. It's okay to care about your siblings. I know I do. But if I told you to stop fighting and then I would tear you limb from limb until you did, would you stop? No? Well then why do you think Genya-san would? He's just like you. He's nothing like me. Seinmi snapped back, but there was a tone there that had Himejima's eyebrows rising. Pity, desperation, fear. Kamado must have sensed it too because when he went on, his voice was quieter, albeit just as firm. It's okay that he's like you. Strong, determined and headstrong. Those aren't necessarily bad traits. They got you to your pillar position. And yeah, he can't use breaths, but there are other ways to fight. And that's okay too. It's not. At least I can hold my own against a demon. So can he. He'll die in the Corps. Kamado's voice quieted even more. Like you did. A heavy pause, and Jiaomai could practically feel the shock and horror coming off of Shinazugawa before his own voice quieted down and he just sounded so tired. Yeah, I was a pillar and look what happened to me. Tired and bitter, actually. More silence. You expected to die, Kamado stated. You joined the Corps expecting to die. You were going to fight until either you or Muzan were dead. Shinazugawa snorted. You don't exactly get into the core to live a long, happy life. I'm here cause I can't live any other way. I will avenge my mother. And after that, the newly turned demon didn't answer with anything other than a derisive snort. After several more seconds of uneasy quiet, Kamado spoke again. You think revenge has brought you this far, and maybe that's a big reason, but you also protect people, Sanmi-san. That's your job and you do it well. Hurting Genya so he leaves you won't help you. It won't make him live a good life either, because it's most certainly hurting him. I don't need him. Genya cut in. Sanmi snarled, presumably at his little brother. But then a softer, feminine voice broke in. How? That came from in front of Gyomai. So, the Kamado girl. What? Genya asked angrily. He sounded like he'd turned his head to look back over his shoulder. How do you not need your brother? I need mine. And he needs me. We need each other and our other siblings. I can't imagine ever losing them. Her voice sounded shaky. Was she crying? Some of us don't have the luxury of just imagining how much it would hurt, Shinazugawa said angrily, although he hadn't raised his voice again. But you have each other here and now, she cried out. And instead of working to help each other and make each other stronger, you're trying to hurt each other and make each other weaker. In the end, that will only kill you both. More silence at her words. When Shinazugawa spoke again, his voice trembled and he sounded more human than Gyomai had heard him that entire time. I just wanted one of you to live. I couldn't protect everyone then, I can't protect you now. I can't even protect myself. Oh, that explained more than Gyomai would like to admit, actually. Which was probably why he found himself speaking up. Genya is stronger than you think. A soft snort. Not strong enough. Gyomai could practically feel his student flinch at his brother's words and withheld a frustrated huff. Before he could rebuff that, though, the wind pillar continued to speak. None of us are strong enough. Not even Kamado. I told you to call me Tanjiro, the boy in question muttered, but he sounded almost pained. Of course we aren't strong enough. Shinobu spoke up for the first time. Humans can't compare to demons. We've known that from the beginning. And even if we could or we were demons, we have how many years of experience as compared to theirs? That doesn't mean we're fighting a losing battle. The core has been on the back foot for as long as it's existed, Shinazugawa said back, although he had little heat in his voice. But it's still here, Shinobu rebutted. Shinazugawa didn't seem to have anything to say to that. We've made more strides in the last years than we have in centuries before that, and we're stronger than we've been since breaths were first invented. And working together, we can take Muzan down. Kamado broke in. I've seen it. I've seen us come so close. I've seen all of the waxing moons gone and Muzan crawling away on all fours as the sun rises. What are you, a seer or something? Genya asked, incredulous. Kamado paused for a moment. Something like that, he muttered before continuing on the same vein as before. But we're stronger now than what I saw. Or we can be. Shinobu spoke again, her voice firm and determined. Kenjiro-san is right. Now, I propose that he, Shinazugawa-san and Nezuko-chan come with me so we can discuss everything that has happened recently. Himejima-san, would you please take Shinazugawa-kun somewhere to cool down? Preferably somewhere where he won't be tempted to start fights that could tear my estate to the ground. Gyomai managed not to wince at that, but it was a near thing. He sensed Genya cringing. Perhaps you should apologize to Shinobu-san, Genya, and I will be writing to Uekata-sama about this. He knew the boy had cringed again, and then he let out a sigh. Please forgive my rashness, Shinobu-san, Genya said quietly, his voice muffled, likely from a doji position. Good. Gyomai bowed as well, holding his prayer beads in front of him. I also ask forgiveness for my students' rash actions. We will most certainly discuss this. A small groan escaped from Genya, just loud enough for Gyomai to hear. At least the boy knew he was in trouble. Then Gyomai turned to where he'd last heard the Kamado girl standing. Thank you, Kamado Nezuko, for interfering and holding my student back from inexcusable actions. The girl must have been surprised because she stuttered a little. It was nothing. Besides, Genya-san is really strong. I had to use my breathing techniques to stop him. You must be a very good teacher. Her sincerity rang in her voice and Gyomai felt a bubble of gratitude for the girl's kind words. You should apologize too, Sanmi-san, Kamado said. What? Shinazugawa yelped. Then something must have happened between the two of them because the next thing Gyomai knew, he heard the wind pillar's petulant voice. Sorry for almost destroying your house, Kacho. That was, honestly, better than Gyomai had expected. Shinobu-san said thoughtfully. I will forgive you if, and only if, it doesn't happen again. I understood? Hi, Shinobu-san, Genya said. Yeah, whatever, Shinazugawa muttered. Then a thwap sounded. Boy, another meaningful pause. It's not like I want to start a fight. More silence. Fine, I won't. Happy, quiet, Shinobu-san said sweetly. Stop acting like you're my mom. Jayomai heard Shinazugawa mutter as he walked by, thankfully without so much as acknowledging Genya. At least not as far as the stone pillar knew. Sometimes he really wished he could see. The younger Shinazugawa, on the other hand, gasped, sounding offended, but he didn't say anything. For the first time since they'd returned from training, he felt proud of the boy. Kamado snorted. You're younger than me. The newly turned demon continued. And yet he has better manners than you, Shinazugawa-san, Shinobu said brightly. What was that? The wind Hashira snarled as the group walked away from Jayomai and Genya. The Kamado girl giggled. Hurry, please, Shinobu said loudly. The last thing I need are two demons wandering around my estate. Do you gotta rub it in? Shinazugawa grumbled. The rest of their chatter faded off as they continued on their way, leaving Jayomai and his student in an awkward silence. Sighing, the stone pillar took a seat next to Genya, who hadn't risen to his feet. From the muffled sniffling, he could tell the boy was trying to hold back tears. Maybe one day he'd get the boy to understand that crying wasn't shameful. Until then, he put a hand on the boy's back. I'm going to write Oyakata-sama and ask him to give us a mission. Genya coughed loudly. We're leaving. Jayomai raised an eyebrow at his student. Do you want to stay? The boy seemed to curl in on himself. I don't know. I don't want to give up. Give up on Kamado. Give up on Sanmi. Give up on himself. Jayomai didn't know and didn't think Genya even knew the answer to that question, so he didn't press for now. Whatever you decide, I will support you, he said. The boy's tense shoulders began to lose their tightness under his hand. Really? Of course. A deep sigh and more tension leaked out of the boy. Thanks, sensei. Jayomai nodded in acknowledgement. They sat there in silence for several seconds before Genya spoke up again. I'm going to be in punishment tomorrow, aren't I? The older man hummed again, amusement entering his voice, although he doubted his student could tell. Tomorrow you will be simultaneously pushing a boulder while pulling another. You will do so until you move them both around the estate or until nightfall, whichever comes first. Genya winced, but then sighed. Yes, sensei. The silence this time felt far more companionable, although when Genya broke through it once again, his voice seemed small and worried. Sensei, what did all of that mean? I mean, Kamado held Sanmi back. He didn't have to. Jayomai sighed. I do not know. Honestly, he didn't even know how to classify what had happened just now, still going over it in his head. I, currently, have drawn no conclusions. Oh, Genya muttered. Finally, the stone pillar figured they'd sat there long enough, and rose to his feet. Come along, Genya. We must prepare for dinner. He was not going to let himself or his students show up dirty, after all. A long sigh. Yes, sensei. As they walked along, Hajime did decide to bring up one other thing he'd noticed. Genya, I am proud of one thing. You seem to be more confident around women lately. The boy tripped and squawked a little. Jayomai frowned. Surely he hadn't been that distracted by his anger and his self-appointed mission. What makes you say that, sensei? The stone pillar blinked. You've spoken to Kamado Nezuko a couple of times and you have been very articulate. I assumed you'd made progress seeing as she is a girl, and you didn't even seem to notice when she was bodily holding you back just now. Genya didn't answer with anything more than a strangled, choking sound of distress, so the boy had been that distracted and angry. Jayomai put a hand to the bridge of his nose and sighed. Then he began to go over some prayers for his student. He needed it more than the Hashira had realized. Akatsuki stared at Yubai Eshiki-sama in bafflement. You're letting me, a former waxing moon, learn your most cherished technique. The man blinked at him. Did you change your mind and not want to after all? No, he said hurriedly. No, I do. It's just, why? You asked and you have given us no reason since you joined for us to doubt you. More blinks because he couldn't seem to process that. He'd been honestly expecting a very harsh no, or at least a polite but firm one. I haven't been here for long. The man's smile turned sad. I don't think we have very long. That took Akatsuki by surprise yet again and he glanced at Kyojiro standing at his side. What do you mean, Oyakata-sama? Kyojiro asked. The older man shook his head. Just a feeling I have. As far as I know, the former waxing moon started slowly. Muzan hasn't found your place yet. I know he knows of a couple of estates where slayers train. But while I don't know which ones, I know it isn't here. You've been pretty thorough in hiding this place. So why? The man shook his head. I've lost my eyesight and I am no longer able to move as well as I could due to my failing health. One way or another, I will leave this world shortly. I do have contingencies in place, do not fear. But for now, we must train as hard as we can because I believe a confrontation is coming. Thus I am giving you permission to learn a breathing style and adapt it as you will. That was more information than Akatsuki expected, and he didn't really know what to say to that. Oyakata-sama, no matter what happens or how sick you are, we will protect you, Kyojiro shouted enthusiastically. The blind man's smile widened. I know, and I thank you. Now, are you willing to teach Akatsuki-san your breathing form? Another large grin. I am. The demon turned to stare at him. He doubted he'd ever get used to Kyojiro's enthusiasm. Then please proceed. Just please do not leave the grounds without my permission, Akatsuki-san, Yubaeshiki-sama said with a nod. Akatsuki did the only thing he really could do at that point. He bowed. It was strange how much he wanted to help this man. With Muzan, he'd been too scared to even think to do otherwise. But Yubaeshiki just had this way about him that he couldn't help but respect. The last person he'd even remotely regarded so highly had been Sensei. Thank you, Oyakata-sama. You are more than welcome, Akatsuki-san. You may go now. Yes, Oyakata-sama, both he and Kyojiro said together. Then they turned and filed out the door. As they walked down the hallway, the flame pillar spoke loudly. You weren't expecting him to say yes. Akatsuki blinked. No, I wasn't. Then let us prove to him that it was a good choice, Kyojiro exclaimed as his grin widened even further. I will start your first lesson today. Come, hurry. And with that, he rushed out the door. Akatsuki chuckled and shook his head before following. Eating Kamado's hand had been the best decision he'd made in a long time, even if no one had realized the consequences at the time. Now he'd finally get the strength he'd been chasing for so long. It was funny, he no longer had the same motivation as he did when under Muzan. But chasing strength still felt right, more like Hakyuji. As a human, he'd found people to love and protect, and even if he'd lost that for literal decades, finding that again felt a bit like coming home. It was different and could never be the same, but it also felt familiar and warm. I can work with this, he thought, anticipating the upcoming training with a grin on his face. XXX, Tanjiro-san, Shinobu called as he walked down the hallway towards the cellar and his room. He would need to finish packing his traveling bag and make sure he had enough bandages and other medical supplies in case they ran into another waxing moon again. He wished he'd thought to do that sooner. Shelving that thought for now, he turned towards the light voice of his hostess, smiling. Shinobu-san. Then he saw the expression on her face. No false smile, no anger. It was more blank than anything. And he could smell concern. What's wrong? I wanted to discuss some findings I've made when it comes to you and your demons. He tried not to wince at that. He really did. They're not, he started, but then sighed, not seeing a point in arguing. He took a deep breath and then focused back on her. What did you find? I just finished with some tests and I've found that you and your subordinates, I suppose, are resistant to my poisons, more so than any other demon I've encountered. Tanjiro frowned as he tried to grasp the implications of that. Wasn't that a good thing? Why is that a problem? She sighed. I will need to try and come up with something more potent to render you or your demons truly unconscious without killing them. Tanjiro blinked, and then he put it together. This is about me being able to burn out my own demon cells from other people, he said softly, suddenly feeling a little sick. He wasn't entirely sure he could even force his power to burn the source of said power out of other people, so he'd taken the idea Nezuko had presented to him to Shinobu-san. He was surprised she'd gotten back to him so quickly. From your reaction, I would guess the pain could wake them. Probably even from a demonic sleep. Shinobu nodded grimly. I am going to have to do some experimentation to find the right balance of poison that will render one of your demons unconscious without killing them. She shook her head. I don't know how long that will take. He may just want to deal with the pain. Tanjiro shook his head emphatically. No, the last time I tried that, the demon died. Shinazugawa has a rather high pain tolerance. But why take the chance? He interrupted gently. Shinobu closed her mouth, but looked puzzled. Tanjiro shook his head again. Let's say it takes you a couple of months to figure out a good poison that would render Sanmi-san so unconscious he wouldn't be able to feel the pain of me literally burning him from the inside out. That's 2 months, or 4 or however many is compared to putting him through excruciating pain and potentially killing him right now. With how everything stands now, I won't do it. He ran his hand through his hair as he sighed wearily. I know he doesn't want to be a demon, I don't either. But waiting a couple of weeks or months for something safer, isn't that a better idea anyway? And I know Tameo-san, at least, is working on a cure for demons. Maybe we won't even have to burn it out of him if we can just wait a little while. The older pillar stared at him for several seconds before a frown appeared on her lips. Those seem like rather weak excuses for you, Tanjiro-san. He winced and looked away, more or less confirming her suspicions. We could also easily test a vial of Shinazugawa's blood to see if the burning process would potentially be more or less painful depending on the cell's reactions. There are still a couple of options available, so what's the real reason? He bit his lip, feeling his fangs press into the soft tissue as he did so, but he didn't break the skin. I can't burn myself with my fire, he whispered. I've tried. At the time I wasn't using my strongest form, but even now I am hesitant to try just because of how much I would have to want to burn myself apart. I would have, back then but that mindset wasn't good at all. But I wanted the demon cells gone, and so I thought maybe. But it didn't work on me. It may not work on them. Even if it does, I don't know how well it will burn the cells out. I have this mental image of them, any one of them, writhing in pain while I try to burn the cells out, but not being able to, or only being able to so slowly that. He shook his head. I can't do that. Not to anyone else, and especially not to Akatsugi-san or Sanmi-san. See, Shinobu-san said slowly. He took a deep breath. I'll do whatever they want, once we've taken care of Muzan. If a cure hasn't been found by then, I'll burn it out if they ask. If you find a way to render them unconscious, I'll see if I can burn it out then. I'll even run your tests on their blood and burn whatever you need me to there. But we need strong fighters for what's coming. And maybe it's selfish of me to want them to remain as strong as they can be, even if that means they remain demons. He didn't want to admit he could still hear the last demon's screams, how they haunted his nightmares, and the idea of making anyone else scream like that made him sick. Shinobu frowned thoughtfully. I still need to tell them both. Tanjiro blinked, surprised. I never thought you wouldn't. The older teen relaxed a little at his words and she nodded. I'll try and emphasize your point of view to Shinazugawa-san, but he might still insist on trying. I am sure he'll listen to the compromise of testing his blood, though. He's not completely unreasonable. Usually. Yeah, the time traveler acquiesced. But if I can't, it'll just be a couple of months. I know he hates it, but a couple of months and a far better chance at success. That's really worth it to me. She sighed and nodded. Let me go talk to him. After that, Tanjiro expected to see the wind pillar storming up to him, demanding that Tanjiro burn the demon cells out. However, Shinobu's argument must have swayed him because the expected confrontation never happened. Later that night, Shinobu called him in to see if he could burn his own demon cells out of another's blood. It turned out he could, but at a much slower rate than normal demon blood. He could definitely feel a resistance. It would only prolong the pain in the best case scenario. With a heavy heart, both he and Shinobu came to the conclusion that at the current time, it wasn't feasible currently. XXX. Nezuko watched the older Shinazugawa as he stood just inside the shadow on the Ingawa. He'd already been there for several minutes, the light creeping towards him as the day moved on. He looked so resigned. Then he seemed to steel himself and he put a hand forward, letting the sunlight touch it, and then snatched it back. He blinked and Nezuko rolled her eyes. They'd already told him that he'd be fine in the sunlight. Slowly, he put his hand back out again into the light and left his hand there. Then he moved his arm and eventually his whole body. A wave of relief seemed to wash over him and she sighed. His new situation couldn't be pleasant, especially for someone like him who had hated demons so much. She was glad he had the comfort of being able to walk under the sun at least. She shook her head and continued on her way, taking her freshly dried laundry back to her room so she could pack. They would be heading back to Urikodaki-sensei's place shortly and she couldn't wait to see her family. She looked forward to seeing how far Takeo and Sanjiro had come. Had Shizuru begun training yet? Had Hinako come home? What about their mother and Rokita? What about Urikodaki-sensei? She couldn't help but smile at the knowledge that all of these questions would be answered very soon. Zenitsu yelled from the room next to hers as she approached it. She sighed. So he and Inosuke had probably heard. Well, it was time to break the news to them anyway. Zenitsu threw open his door and saw her at the end of the hallway. He ran up to her, eyes tearing up and snot beginning to drip from his nose. She really hoped he'd grow out of that soon. Yes, Zenitsu-san. He stopped and looked at her in horror. What's with the san all of a sudden? No, just Zenitsu. Just Zenitsu. She sighed. I did that to get your attention. You promised you wouldn't yell my name out like that again unless you were in danger. Were you in danger? He sniffed and looked down. No. She knew it was manipulative, but that childish attitude of his would just be detrimental to him and everyone around him in the future unless someone helped him get over it. Sometimes she felt like she was friends with a boy no older than Rokita, no matter how old he actually was. Okay, please calmly tell me what is going on and we can address it, okay? She made sure to add a smile on at the end. Ai-san said you're leaving. Yep, she said with a bright, very genuine smile. But what about us? She sighed and reached out to pat his head. He squawked and backed away, pouting. It looks like you'll just have to pack. He blinked. Huh? She giggled. I got permission to bring both you and Inosuke with us. We're all going to go and do some training with Yurikodaki-sensei. His face immediately brightened. Really? Of course, she replied fondly. Now go find Inosuke. We're leaving tonight after dinner. Zenitsu grinned a huge grin and went to rush off, but then stopped and looked back at her. Why tonight? We all slept this morning, she said with a shrug. We're used to staying up into the night. Besides, there would be 2 demons with them. And while they could easily walk under the sunlight, they would be the most comfortable at night. Making small allowances for Shinazugawa-san seemed like it might be a good idea right now. Also, our escort, she had to concentrate to not make a face at that, arrived early this morning and is still sleeping. Escort? The yellow-haired boy asked. Nezuko shrugged. I haven't met them yet. All right, Zenitsu muttered. Then he shook his head and forced a bright smile. I'll go find the boar. We'll be back soon. Okay, she said with a wave, then continued to her room. She didn't have much to pack, just an extra uniform and some of her personal items, but she also wanted to make sure she had all of the candy and little wooden toys she'd bought for her brothers and sisters. Having her own income was very nice indeed. XXX. Shinobu wasn't surprised when neither Tanjiro nor Shinazugawa came to dinner. Completely understandable in her opinion. Preferable even. Their newest resident demon claimed he didn't have much control over his appetite yet, and being around people gathered specifically to eat seemed like an invitation for trouble. She, Kanao, Ai and the triplets set the dining room up and finished just as their guests began to show up. Kamado Nezuko came to the room first, looking around excitedly, but then slumped a little when she didn't see her brother there. She still bowed politely and made her way to where Ai gestured for her to go to sit. Nezuko was followed by the 2 very loud, young demon slayers she'd arrived with. Thankfully, both of them took one look at Shinobu and her smile, and decided to behave themselves. She knew they were both smart. It took some digging to find that intelligence, but she could see it. Then Hajime-san and the younger Shinazugawa came in and both relaxed in relief at the lack of any demons in the vicinity. Last but not least, Obanai-san came in looking rather grumpy. He still bowed politely and took a seat. Shinobu introduced him to the people there and then they began to eat. The dinner that followed also happened to be one of the most stilted, awkward dinners Shinobu had ever eaten. Conversation was short and terse and it appeared that no one wanted to break the long silences that seemed to be becoming alarmingly common. She was both concerned and relieved that so many would be leaving her house that evening, to be honest. Both of the Shinazugawas and Obanai could be volatile. Add in the demonic transformation and the whole situation in general could turn out very badly, but at least she wouldn't have to be the one dealing with it anymore. No, she'd only be dealing with the demon doctor who would be coming to the butterfly estate in the next couple of days so that they could compare notes and begin to formulate a cure for demonic transformations. And, if they were very lucky and hard-working, a poison that could affect Muzan himself. She doubted she'd be getting much sleep. How was this her life? XXX. Hello, I'm Kamado Tanjiro, Nezuko's older brother said with a bow to Iguro-san, who was apparently the pillar who would accompany them to see the Kamado family. Behind them, Shinazugawa stood away from everyone else, glaring at everything and nothing when he wasn't staring angrily at the ground as if it had personally offended him. I'm pleased to meet you in person, Tanjiro finished with a bright smile. The new pillar snorted and didn't introduce himself back. Rude, especially to someone who still sounded so kind. And completely like a demon. Nope, not going there. Not right now. When Iguro did respond, he surprised more or less everyone. If you ever hurt Kenroji at all, in any way, I will find a way to destroy you utterly. I don't care how powerful you are. And they won't find the body. Next to Zenitsu, Nezuko gasped and looked somewhere between shocked and furious. He could also hear Inosuke take a deep breath, either trying to make himself look larger or about ready to shout something out. Zenitsu himself couldn't help but just be mortified that someone would be that ill-mannered. No, mean. He'd been downright mean. However, before anyone could really react to that, Tanjiro spoke, sounding confused. Of course no one will find a body if I die. I'm a demon. If everyone had been taken aback before, they were outright shocked now. Even Shinobu-san's eyes widened in surprise. Nezuko's expression had turned pained and frustrated and Inosuke didn't seem to know what to say to that so he just deflated, letting out a long puff of air. Zenitsu could relate. And with those spoken words, the lightning breath user couldn't avoid acknowledging what he heard anymore. Any sound of human from the older Kamado sibling had either vanished or was buried so deeply under the sound of demon that it may as well be non-existent. And yet he didn't look offended at all, or like he would attack anyone. Or, well, anything demonic. The anger, pain, rage, hurt was still there too, but still sounded as if it were buried, just as it had before. The pillar didn't seem to know how to take that either, as he just leaned back, as if trying to get the whole view of Kamado Tanjiro because he'd missed something. Kind, Zenitsu thought. You missed his kindness, and apparently his bluntness. Shinazugawa had rolled his eyes and turned away with clenched fists, although he didn't sound really angry. Just hurt and frustrated too. Besides, Tanjiro spoke up again, drawing everyone's attention. Why would I ever hurt Mitsuri? She's my friend. The pillar bristled, and that was when the rope around his neck moved, causing Zenitsu to realize that it was actually a snake. He'd thought the second sound of a rather slow heartbeat had been part of the guy's breath style or something. But no, it had been a snake around his neck while he ate. What? Pillars were all crazy and loud. He could hear the dark-haired Hashira practically screaming inside his head about how Tanjiro had just confessed that he was a demon. Right? Just what had happened there. Tanjiro had been so determined to not let whatever had been turning him into a demon go any further. And yet, here they were. He made a mental note to talk to either Nezuko or her brother later, if he could work up the courage. It looked like the new pillar was gearing up to say something. But before he did, Tanjiro spoke up again. I'm relieved though, he said with that bright smile that showed off his two sharp teeth again. You and Mitsuri. He paused and glanced over at Zenitsu and Inosuke, then shrugged. I was going to tell you guys anyway. He turned back to the new pillar. The first time, you two were planning on getting married before. Well, I'd love to see that happen here. Wait, what? What did he mean before? If he knew the new pillar before, why was he introducing himself? And was he actually giving up on a super cute girl? What was going on? The Hashira looked as utterly shocked as Zenitsu felt, and he once again leaned back a little. Wait, what? What are you saying? Next to Zenitsu, Nezuko burst out laughing. He sees Mitsuri as a sister, just like I do. Tanjiro brightened at that and turned to Nezuko excitedly. Oh, do you think we could get mom to adopt her? I mean, I know she already has a family, but just imagine how much Rokita would love her. Or Hanako, Nezuko agreed, her voice soft and warm. The older sibling's grin widened for a couple of seconds, then he seemed to remember where he was. Oh, right. In any case, you should totally ask her or her family for an official omiai. She'll be thrilled. Although, I have to say, if you hurt her, you'll regret it. And with that, his smile turned sharp and his sound gained a threatening edge, and even though his threat's words seemed far more vague and less threatening, he meant it, and just his intent made it so much scarier than the other man's. How was this family so scary? The newcomer spluttered as what was visible of his face went red. You can't just say that. And the clueless, innocent boy was back. Why not? You just did, didn't you? How did he seem so utterly sincere when he said things like that? The snake man looked about ready to draw his sword, and behind Tanjiro, Shinazugawa seemed awfully conflicted and like he wouldn't intervene, which was likely why Shinobu-san strode past them. Taguro-san, you haven't introduced yourself to Kamado-san. Don't you think that you, as a pillar, should set a good example for the upcoming generation? With that she turned and gestured to Nezuko, Zenitsu, Inosuke and her own Sugyuko. Suyuri-san. The serpent pillar shot a betrayed look at Shinobu-san, and from what Zenitsu could hear, he was grinding his teeth. Then he inclined his head, ever so slightly towards Tanjiro. Taguro Obanai, serpent pillar. It was funny. As he said the words, he didn't sound as angry as he had before. Zenitsu only heard more confusion, actually. Kamado Tanjiro seemed to have that sort of effect on people. Perhaps everyone should introduce themselves again before we get going. Shinobu-san said, cocking her head to one side and still smiling. Zenitsu gulped, not wanting to take his eyes off of her. She had to be the worst threat here. She had to be. Demons or no. Kamado Nezuko, please take care of me. The younger Kamado sibling said as she bowed politely. It took Zenitsu a moment to realize that he was next. Trying not to panic, he quickly bowed as Nezuko straightened and shouted, Agatsuma Zenitsu. Pleased to meet you. Inosuke didn't even bother bowing. Lord Hashibara Inosuke, you may bow before me. Nezuko giggled. Zenitsu face palmed. Even Tanjiro sighed fondly. Boarhead must have really made an impression at the final selection. Let's just get out of here. Shinazugawa grumbled and stepped past the two pillars in front of the gate. After I speak with Shinobu-san, Iguro practically growled and stomped past everyone, then took Shinobu off to the side. Zenitsu wasn't sure if he should listen into this or not, but in the end, his curiosity got the best of him. Just this once. Oh, I'm so glad you want to speak with me now instead of just leaving like you wanted to earlier. She sounded so happy, and yet there was an underlying edge of censure too. No wonder Shinobu-san scared everyone. Why am I the only Hashira that's going against two demons that are pillar level or higher? Now that Zenitsu thought about that, it really didn't sound like the best situation. He gulped, but Tanjiro didn't sound like he wanted to attack them. No, he'd never do that. Shinobu-san's voice gained a grim, serious tone. We don't have much of a choice. All of the other pillars are needed for their own missions. It's your turn to train and someone needs to go with them. The best I could possibly do is hold them off while the others escape, Iguro returned. The insect pillar sighed. I don't think you'll need to worry about that. She shook her head. He's had so many opportunities to really do damage to a large portion of the core. If he hasn't already, I seriously doubt he's going to. Zenitsu glanced at them out of the corner of his eye. Iguro did not look appeased. He did seem resigned though, and Shinazugawa. A pause. I'm less sure about him. But as long as you take precautions, I don't think you'll have a problem with him either. The girl looked pained at her answer. We should have just killed them when we had the chance. And her teasing tone came right back. Now, Iguro-san, that isn't a very nice thing to say about the person supporting you in your love. The serpent pillar hissed at her before he turned and stalked past everyone again. Come on, he yelled and practically stormed out of the gates. Shinazugawa watched him stomp past, looking torn between amusement and pity. Thankfully, Iguro either didn't see the expression or didn't care. Zenitsu had to put his money on the former. The serpent pillar didn't seem like the kind of man who would let that slide. Goodbye, Shinobu-san. Thank you so much for your care, Nezuko said as she hurried after the pillars and her brother who was also waving as he walked out of the yard. Why yes, Zenitsu said hurriedly as he turned and bowed. We are in your debt. No we're not, Renetsu, Inosuke said, sounding offended. Don't listen to him, Zenitsu practically yelled. Goodbye. And with that, he grabbed the boar's arm and dragged him out of the compound, ignoring Inosuke's yells to let him go. He only conceded to the demands as they caught up to Nezuko and Tanjiro, both speaking quietly. Nyai-chan, Nezuko whispered, her voice worried. I'm not so sure about them. She pointed to the two pillars walking ahead of them. It really was so cute how much she cared for her family and friends. Then again, everything about her was cute. Zenitsu sighed happily. Tanjiro, for his part, smiled over at her, warm and real. I'm fine, Nezuko. Shinazugawa needs time. And as for Iguro, well, that's just how he is until he gets to know you. Somehow, that doesn't make me feel any better, she returned, voice just a little dry. Tanjiro reached up and patted her head. We'll be fine, Nezuko. This is a good thing. We just have to get him to see that. His younger sister huffed good-naturedly. You're too positive for your own good, Nyai-chan. Suddenly, something sounded off, discordant almost inside of Tanjiro. His sister's words had brought up something that hurt him. But his smile still looked all too real. How utterly terrifying. Yeah, but that's who I am. That off note was still there. Nezuko looked a little exasperated at that, but she didn't say anything else. Instead, she shook her head fondly. Come on, Renitsu. The sooner we get there, the sooner we can train to become stronger and fight more people. Inosuke suddenly said, as if his ranting for the last 5 minutes at Zenitsu and the pillars and everyone else hadn't happened. With that, the crazy boar-headed guy took off. Hey, Zenitsu yelled, worried about being the last one in the party. Wait for me. XXX. Akatsuki felt as if his lungs were on fire, along with the rest of his body. This had to be close to what most demons under the sun felt. But a face of yellow and red hair leaned over him, grinning widely. You did it, Akatsuki-san. Is this what you slayers have to do all the time? The demon asked, because that had hurt. He could already feel his healing working on his body, but still. And humans didn't have that luxury. Kyojiro just closed his eyes when his grin widened. It is. Akatsuki didn't groan, but it was a near thing. With this new perspective, he'd have to reevaluate any demon slayer he came across who could use a breath form of any kind. Definitely not weaklings. And now it's time to try it again, Kyojiro said with his booming voice, straightening as if that would give Akatsuki the motivation he needed. It didn't. He rolled over, though, and pushed himself to his hands and knees, and then to his feet. He didn't know how long he had to learn this, so he didn't have time to rest now, no matter how much it hurt. Alright, let me try again, he said and braced himself. He would get this down. He would. Violence warning for this one, demons eating and all. Saying he wasn't stupid. Driven, yes. Hard-working, sure. Angry, well, who wouldn't be after living his life? Impulsive, sometimes, maybe. But he was not stupid. He felt stupid now though. Not that he'd admit that aloud. Ever, but that gnawing pain in his stomach that relentlessly drove him to want to consume everyone around him. How was that kid still sane? How was any demon still sane? He paused for just a moment at that and realized what he'd thought. Scratch that. He'd known demons were driven by hunger. He hadn't realized the depths of the madness that hunger could drive demons to. But the actions of all demons made a lot more sense now. More than he would have liked to ever understand. And this wasn't even as bad as it could be. He could remember how he had felt when he'd initially been transformed. As blurry as those memories were, his recollection of the hunger remained. Nothing had mattered above finding something to eat. Well, except not angering Kamado, for reasons he really didn't want to think about right now, or ever, because Sanmi wasn't subservient to anyone. He'd served Oyakata-sama out of respect and choice, and could leave that commitment at any time. He'd known that, and it honestly made all the difference, because now he couldn't. Nope, think of something else. A pang shooting through his stomach had him grimacing, but he pushed on, continuing to lead the trek towards the water cultivator's home. The darkness of near midnight did nothing to diminish his eyesight, so it made sense for him to lead. He pushed the knowledge that either Kamado's sibling knew the way far better than he ever would, and one of them had just as good of eyesight aside. The truth was, however, if he stayed ahead of them, he couldn't smell them as much and his mouth wouldn't water. He wouldn't have to interact with anyone and they wouldn't see his weakness. He was barely holding himself back from attacking them, and he wasn't sure he could hold himself back if they came across a demon. Was his hunger getting stronger again? He swallowed, and the sense of his strangely shaped tongue just reinforced the entire situation. He hated it. No, he loathed it. And he'd also begun to feel very differently towards every demon he'd ever killed. Up to and including his mother, because this was no way to live. Killing them truly had been a mercy. It was yet another thing he'd known but not truly understood. He sensed someone coming up behind him and stiffened. He didn't want to talk to anyone right now, or ever again, really. He'd always preferred to work alone on missions, and now that he was, well, the change hadn't exactly helped that. He took a deep breath and willed his mind away from the hunger. It was either that or run. It didn't work very well, but it would have to do for now. So came the quiet drawl of his fellow pillar. Ah, Iguro. He was not looking forward to this conversation. Get lost. A snort. I see becoming a demon hasn't changed your personality much. Sanmi grit his teeth. Part of him wanted to turn around and yell at the younger man. It was what he would have done as a human, after all. However, such aggressive action would have different consequences now, and he knew any rash actions may very well start a fight he didn't think any of them could truly afford at the moment, so he bit his tongue. Literally, which was a bad idea because tasting even his own demon blood only seemed to make his hunger worse, despite tasting as terrible as blood ever did as a human. So he walked on. Iguro must have realized that wasn't what he would normally do, because he commented, almost thoughtfully, maybe you did change some. Oh, more than some, and he absolutely despised his fellow pillar for bringing that up. It was like he wanted to take Sanmi's situation and dance on it, with spiked geta and salt. What do you want? He growled. Iguro seemed to think about that for a moment before he finally spoke. Shinobu wasn't sure you could control yourself. Can you? Straight to the point. He could appreciate that. He also recognized that Iguro was scoping out the threat level. Despite the situation, Sanmi approved, which was why he answered truthfully. For now, he could practically hear a frown in the other's voice as he spoke. How long does that for now last? Sanmi snorted. Like I know. A huff of exasperation. Are we talking days, weeks, months, minutes? The wind pillar frowned. Not minutes. He felt his lips tighten in worry, anger, frustration, fear, some unholy combination thereof. Could be days or weeks. I don't know. They walked in relative silence for several seconds before the newer pillar spoke again. Is it really that bad? Sanmi actually laughed that time, albeit mirthlessly. Oh, it's worse. The hunger or the demonic instincts. The wind pillar felt his nails dig into the palms of his hands, which just made the air scent with blood, which did not help him right now. Thankfully, it was the scent of his own blood, which didn't smell appealing in the slightest, so there was that at least. Focus on that. Both. More silence. Then Sanmi heard himself talking again. Unsure as to why. There's no way to describe it, he muttered quietly. Then he ran his new tongue over his pointed teeth. I know hunger. With how I grew up, how could I not? Sometimes we went without food for days. It was rare, but it happened. Had he always sounded this? Bitter? Yeah, probably. When he wasn't angry, in any case. But anger had been his default for so long because it was easy, and a good motivator. But he couldn't rely on it now because it would be too easy to lose control. There were times where if he so much as swore, it would just send everything crashing down. He could tell. He probably hated that most of all. It felt like being a demon had taken an integral part of who he was away from him. But no matter how hungry I got, it never came close to this. He looked over at the serpent pillar, his new eyesight making it easy to read the other man's expression in the dark. Demons are all mad because this hunger drives them there. He snorted and looked back at the path ahead of them. That and they have Musen in their head. At least he didn't have that. No matter how many problems he had with Kamado, even he couldn't deny he had it infinitely better than most other demons. And right now, he'd take what he could get. Another long stretch of silence fell between them, broken only by the soft, upbeat chatter of the people, the children, behind them. "Do you want me to kill you?" Iguro asked. Seimi almost gasped and wasn't sure why he'd had that reaction because it certainly wasn't out of shock. He looked over to Iguro, realizing the man had been utterly serious. And he considered it, seriously considered it. Because he wasn't sure how long he could fight this hunger and the madness it wanted to drive him to, whether he gave in or not. He wasn't sure when he would break, when he wouldn't be able to stand it anymore. And he wasn't stupid enough to think he wouldn't break. He still didn't know how Kamado could do it for as long as he had. It was mind-blowing. Once again seeing the seriousness in the other pillar's eyes, he also felt a wave of gratitude knowing that someone else was there, watching him. Someone else who could stop him if he went too far. Someone else who had likely offered out of concern for him just as much as he'd had concern for everyone else. It was a load off of his mind and he suddenly felt lighter for it. Which was why he let out one single chuckle and smiled. Well, kind of. Shinazugawa Seimi didn't smile. Not nicely. He'd always seen it as a weakness. But he was sure Iguro would understand the half-smirk that appeared on his face. "Not yet," he answered. "I'm still of use to the core right now." Detrimental to his own brother and, well, basically everyone else. But if he could somehow help bring down Musen and his ilk like this, well, maybe it would be worth it. Barely, maybe. Iguro nodded. "Let me know if you change your mind." Seimi nodded back. "I will." The silence that followed felt far more companionable than any he'd experienced in a long time, maybe ever. The forest around them fell silent as they approached, then picked up after they moved on, the creatures likely sensing the demons somehow. The crescent moon gave very little light, and thus the stars were out in full force, with the exception of some clouds here and there blocking a couple of constellations. Seimi rarely paid attention to the stars. It was kind of a pity. "Do you trust the kid?" Iguro asked suddenly. Seimi blinked at him, unsure as to how to answer that. He had so many conflicting opinions about Kamado he wasn't sure he could answer it. But Iguro sounded like he needed an insider's viewpoint. The worst part was, Seimi wasn't sure what he wanted Iguro's decision to be. Not anymore. Well, if the other man just got more confused along the way, it was his own fault for asking Seimi at all. "He prioritized me," the wind pillar practically whispered, eyes ahead again, lost in the memory of the flames around him and knowing he was dead and then being carried away as he struggled to stay alive. My life was more important to him than taking out the number one demon, Musen's right hand. After everything he must have gone through, he still chose me. And he didn't even like me. He paused and then snorted softly. The feeling was mutual, still is in a lot of ways, and he actually stopped as he realized something. Kamado hadn't just been resisting eating everyone around him, but he'd been able to resist attacking Seimi as a human, who'd had Marechi blood, who had been openly and constantly bleeding. For hours, Seimi wasn't sure he'd last a single second. He swore, quietly, but he put in just about every word he knew that would be remotely offensive for good measure. He was glad now wasn't one of those times he had to keep a perfect rein on his anger in case he triggered his demonic instincts. "What was that about?" Iguro asked once Seimi had quieted again. The demon took a deep breath and finally continued walking on, thankful that no one behind them had mentioned anything. He and the serpent pillar weren't that far ahead. But apparently it had been enough. On the way to the final selection area, I made sure I was constantly bleeding, in small ways, of course. Nothing too big. But I was convinced I'd wear him down and he'd attack me. He could practically sense Iguro's eyebrow raising. He didn't, I assume. No, Seimi growled. He'd never met someone with a will like that before. The more he learned about Kamado, the more terrifying he became. "I'm guessing you'd attack a Marechi?" Iguro asked. Seimi snorted self-deprecatingly. "I'm not sure I'd even remember anything after smelling regular human blood." Iguro said, once again thoughtful, if maybe a little troubled. Seimi glanced over at him only to see him looking over his shoulder at the group behind them. He'd asked. "I don't like the kid," Seimi said. "He doesn't like me. Not really, no matter how he acts. He's a self-righteous, hypocritical brat that has a hard time seeing more than 2 feet in front of his face." "But," Iguro pressed. The wind pillar deflated a little. "But, I trust him." It felt like he'd had to pry the words out of his mouth. They tasted disgusting on his tongue. "I hate that I do. He's a demon." Well, so was Seimi, but the point still stood. "Thing is, he saved me. I hate what he did to me, but I get why he did it, and it wasn't to hurt me or anyone else." "You respect him," Iguro muttered, surprised. Seimi winced and then let out a sigh. Yeah, I do. The white-haired demon shook his head, laughing wryly. I'm not even sure Kamado's still sane. He glanced over his shoulder at the brat, who was laughing at something his sister had said. He's just not mad in the normal way demons are. Iguro said again. Then he nodded. Thank you for speaking with me. Sammy sighed and waved his hand through the air. Yeah, whatever. The serpent pillar snorted. They didn't say anything else for the rest of the night. XXX. Obanai hadn't been expecting Kamado to approach him, especially not with an extremely serious, determined expression on his face. Kamado, he said slowly, warily. Sammy's getting hungry, the boy started grimly. He hasn't had nearly enough time to sleep for his body to get used to. He paused and glanced over at the white-haired demon. He turned his gaze back on the serpent pillar. It's already pushing him and I'm not sure how long we have until he snaps and attacks the nearest human or demon. I have two suggestions. 1. We get him to sleep. One of us carries him more or less the rest of the way and then we put him into a room and let him sleep until he wakes up naturally. 2. We go hunting for demons for him to eat. Obanai had jumped a little at the word hunting and it took him a moment to remember that Kamado and his demons could eat Musen's demons for food. What a strange and extremely disturbing ability. The serpent pillar's eyes narrowed as a question rose in his mind. Why are you talking to me about it and not Shinazugawa-san? Because I want to know that you're okay with accompanying us if he decides on the latter, right? Because he'd have to accompany them as per his orders. The idea did not appeal, and yet it was better than the alternative. So he nodded, albeit hesitantly. Whatever he decides, I'll deal with. Kamado seemed relieved as he nodded. Thank you, Iguro-san. We should probably speak with him as soon as we can. Obanai shrugged. How about now? The boy smiled, his large, sharp teeth glinting in the moonlight. Obanai managed to suppress a shudder then followed the sun pillar as he turned and approached the white-haired demon. What do you want? Shinazugawa practically growled, looking more like a caged animal than a human for a moment. It was eye-opening. Obanai hadn't known the wind pillar well before, but those times he'd had to interact, the man hadn't been nearly this aggressive. No, he'd definitely been this aggressive but in a more controlled, almost nonchalant way. So, perhaps feral. Yes, that fit. He hadn't been this feral. Kamado here says you're going to snap soon. It was disconcerting because when he'd spoken to the wind pillar the previous night, he'd seemed far more stable. Seeing him degenerate so rapidly concerned him. Yeah, what of it? Shinazugawa didn't quite yell, but he certainly didn't hide the threat in his words either. You can either sleep or eat, Obanai said with a shrug. In his ear, Kaburamaru hissed in warning as the demon they were confronting drew in on himself, not in defense, but in preparation to attack. Kamado had pinched the bridge of his nose and muttered something under his breath before stepping in between the two pillars. Then he addressed Shinazugawa, leaving his back completely open to Obanai. The show of trust surprised him. If you want to sleep, that's fine. One of us can carry you the whole way. That's how I carried my sister when she became a demon. We can find a box for you to sleep in if you'd like. The biggest problem, though. He paused and glanced back at Obanai, and then past him at the three other children who were speaking in their own huddle as they set up camp for the night. The first time my sister slept, it was for 2 years straight. To be fair, we couldn't wake her up. And she slept constantly after that too. The first time I slept straight through, it was for 3 years, and I was on a normal sleep schedule after that. Thing is, the way everything is escalating, Musen will likely attack the core within the year. No one spoke at that. One didn't have to be a genius to put the implications together. After several seconds, Kamado continued. The other alternative, well, you have to eat something or your body will force you to. It's better if you do it on your terms or you will have no control over who you attack. Shinazugawa's anger had melted off of his face into a cool stoicism that didn't really seem like him at all. But Obanai heard of how the wind pillar got when pushed too far though. He tended to get very quiet before he exploded, like the eye of a storm or the calm before a storm. It felt like an eternity before the white-haired demon finally spoke, his voice shaking but restrained. It's happened to you. Kamado winced and looked down in shame. Yes, too often. Obanai studied the younger demon. He looked genuinely pained because of that admission, ashamed of his past. Not that the serpent pillar could blame him. Shinazugawa, who had also been studying Kamado, deflated and looked away, gritting his teeth as he spoke. Where can we find a demon? Obanai felt for the man. Demon. He hadn't really had a choice, all things considered. For his part, Kamado didn't draw attention to that fact. Instead, he simply moved on, apparently having been prepared for both options. I asked Yubayashiki-sama if there were any reports near here. He answered that wherever we go, we simply have to tell him and report back. You told him, Shinazugawa hissed, baring his teeth. Kamado didn't so much as flinch. I just said that some of the group was getting restless. Nothing else. The wind pillar looked surprised at that, then relieved as he backed down. Oh, good. If we want to get there before dawn so we have an actual chance of finding the demon, we need to get going. The towns we can visit. He continued to explain to the two other pillars which assignments they had been offered and which one he thought would be the best. Once they'd decided on a mission, Kamado took out his inkstone and paper, beginning to compose a note on a nearby rock. Demon eyesight must really be amazing if he could write in this light. Okay, something you have to know is that the demon cannot see me, and if he does, I cannot be recognizable. I'm going to tie my hair up under cloth and will have to tie a blindfold over my eyes, but even then, it probably won't take Muzan long to recognize me. If the demon doesn't see Shinazugawa, all the better as he's obviously a demon. And demons attacking demons, especially on a hunt, will draw attention. He paused as he finished writing the missive and then whistled for his crow, handing the folded paper over. The crow took off, leaving them behind. Also, we have to wait to cut off their head, Kamado finished, turning to face them. Wait for what? Obanai asked, frowning. Demons dissolve if you take their head. But sometimes, any parts of their body that have been cut off won't disintegrate until they touch sunlight. Which is why Shinobu-san can study demon cells and has a supply of demon blood. So we gotta cut off his arms and legs before we cut off his head, Shinazugawa asked, looking a little sick, and more than a little hungry. He really was on the verge of snapping. Kamado nodded. I'll go tell Nezuko, Zenitsu and Inosuke. They can sleep here for the night and morning and we'll meet up with them farther ahead. With that and a firm nod, he turned and stalked off towards the younger trio. The other two watched him go. He really took charge there, Obanai commented. Shinazugawa snorted but didn't say anything. Are we really going along with this? The serpent pillar asked. The wind pillar didn't answer for several seconds. When he did, it was quiet and pained. Do I have a choice? Obanai decided not to respond and the two of them waited in silence for Kamado to finish. 5 minutes later, the three pillars were racing through the treetops towards the village they'd chosen, hoping they'd get there in time to find the potential local demon. XXX. The mission was a stretch of road where travelers had been disappearing lately. It could be bandits, but people's items that bandits would have been after had been found, and the disappearances all seemed to happen after sunset. There were just too many coincidences for the Demon Slayer Corps to not investigate. Sanmi was pretty sure they would run into a demon just from the description alone. He found himself licking his lips at the prospect of being able to eat again, and hated himself for it. Once they reached the path, though, they all convened for a last-minute strategy meeting. They decided that Kamado and Sanmi would hide in the trees and treetops while Aguro would run along the road as bait. Once the demons showed themselves, they'd surround it. Sanmi and Kamado would then attack from the back. We should intend to pin them, Kamado said. Any one of us could likely kill them, but we're here for. Yeah, we know, Sanmi growled. He was doing that a lot lately and couldn't really control it. He hated that too. You gonna try to cure them? He asked after taking a deep breath and focusing on anything that wasn't his stomach. Kamado wilted. You saw what happened when I tried without Shinobu-san's poisons. He shook his head. I won't torture them to death, even if it makes them human again. And I'm not ready for. He faded off, then shook his head harshly. Not now. Sanmi and Aguro both nodded, although the serpent pillar looked a little surprised. Had he not been informed? Or had he been informed and just didn't think he'd ever have to deal with it personally? Either way, Sanmi decided not to bring attention to it. They initiated their plan, with Obanai running along the path. It was a fairly well-traveled road that led to a fork. One side would go up to a pass, one would follow the base of the mountain and eventually branch off to a series of towns and cities. The disappearances tended to happen around the fork. Once they reached said fork, they decided they would head for the cities before backtracking if they didn't run into anyone. But one person running alone at night should be good bait. And thankfully, it paid off. Sanmi smelled the demon before he saw it. His mouth began to water and it took every ounce of will to hold back from attacking immediately. Instead, he focused on moving around behind the demon who had appeared in front of Obanai, blocking his path. Well, what has you in such a hurry? A middle-aged man asked Aguro with a smile. He looked very well fed. Was that a demon thing? Or had he gotten that way before becoming a demon? And how good would that make him taste? Sanmi wrenched his thoughts away from that line of thought very quickly. The demon took a second look at Aguro, who had already withdrawn his sword and taken a stance. Oh, it's a demon slayer. How wonderful. If I can kill you, Muzan-sama might make me a Kazuki. Aguro rolled his eyes. That ticked the demon off even more, and in an instant, his facade fell away, revealing tentacles. It looked like the bottom half of an octopus had grown out of his back. It was both terrifying and exciting because there were more limbs to slice off. He really hated himself right now, and Kamado, and Musen, and the demon, because this was what he'd been reduced to. Before the demon could attack, though, Kamado shot forward. Instead of going to pin the man down as planned, he sliced off as many appendages as he could reach. The demon screamed. The scent of blood filled the air, and any hold on Sanmi's self-control vanished. He didn't even remember the rest of the fight. He only remembered attacking and finally sating that ever-growing hunger inside of him. He woke up crouched on the ground with blood on his hands and the aftertaste of something very satisfying in his mouth while the sun rose behind Kamado and Iguro, who both stood together on the other side of the road watching him warily. He blinked, then closed his eyes and took a deep breath, standing up as fluidly as he could, pretending the blood wasn't flaking off of him as the light hit it. "The demon?" he asked. "Dead," Iguro stated. The wind pillar nodded, then went to open his mouth when he realized he honestly didn't want to know anything else. Not right now. He'd likely have questions later, but not yet. So he closed his mouth with a clop and looked away. The hunger was still there, but not the overwhelming force it had become. He'd take it if it meant he wouldn't attack his fellow demon slayers. That didn't mean he had to like it. "That tongue of yours could be a very useful weapon," the serpent pillar pointed out. That was the last thing the wind pillar wanted to hear at the moment. Even Sanmi had more tact than that, and judging from Kamado's incredulous look at Iguro, he agreed. But Sanmi just felt so tired right now, tired of everything, but especially the hunger. So instead of instigating a fight or a shouting match, he simply shot a poisonous glare at the other two, turned around and began to walk back down the road the way they'd come, hating himself more with every step. He always had hated monsters. Gyaaaa. Nezuko heard Zenitsu yell and looked ahead just as three people appeared on the road. "Nai-san," she said happily when she saw her brother and his fellow pillars. "Oh, it's you guys," the lightning breather said, relieved. "I just heard demons." Tanjiro's face fell a little and Shinazugawa turned away. The older pillar seemed better than he had been, though. From the moment they'd set off, he'd practically radiated a sort of restless energy that had put most of their group on edge. Now, though, that energy had vanished, or at least calmed significantly. The white-haired demon seemed less like he would attack them at any moment in any case, so apparently their hunting had worked. He seemed more sullen though, and honestly, Nezuko couldn't blame him for that. She really pitied him. She also suspected that he'd hate that pity, so she tried not to show it, focusing back on her brother. "Welcome back," she said brightly, then realized she was being rude. To Iguro-san and Shinazugawa-san as well. Her ever-amazing brother just smiled at her, so sweet and warm and genuine. "Glad to be back, Nezuko." Before she could say anything, Inosuke burst forward. "How dare you guys go looking for fights without me?" Tanjiro just smiled placatingly. "Sorry, Inosuke, but it was kind of a personal hunt," he harumphed. Nezuko was a little surprised he seemed to understand that and backed down. "Maybe it was a bore thing." "Fine, but you owe me a fight." Her brother just laughed. "Okay, once we get to Yurikodaki-sensei's place and I greet my family, we'll talk with Yurikodaki-sensei about training and sparring. This is a training trip, after all." Still not pleased, Inosuke agreed with a sullen harumph. Then something seemed to occur to him and he perked up. After that, there was no stopping him. Inosuke rushed ahead yelling about how they had to hurry and get there already. Tanjiro just sighed and shook his head fondly. Nezuko could relate. "I guess that means we're running," her older brother said, voice amused. "Otherwise he'll get lost." "Whaat?" Zenitsu yelled, horrified. "Inosuke has a very good sense of direction." "Nai-san," Nezuko replied in defense of the aggressive boy, ignoring her other friend's outburst. "True, but does he even know where to go?" "Well, he had her there. Besides, it's good training." "But," Zenitsu started, so Nezuko turned to him. "Please, for me," she asked quietly. She knew exactly what she was doing and felt a little bad for it, but if it worked and pushed him to try a little harder. "So, just this once. Anything for you, Nezuko-chan," he exclaimed. And that quickly, he was off. Neither Iguro-san or Shinazugawa-san looked happy, but neither of them objected as the others began to use their breath styles to chase after the boar-headed boy. XXX. They managed to make it to Yurikodaki-sensei's place before night fell that day, and Nezuko had been shocked to be reminded of her time spent there. The area felt like home, just as much as their little house on the mountain ever had. It set her heart at ease to know her family was here and safe and that she had somewhere to go back to again. Having her younger siblings come running up to greet them didn't hurt in the slightest. The moment they saw them, she and Tanjiro rushed forward to throw their arms around Shidru, Rokita, and, she noticed with pleased surprise, Hanako, the senior Rengoku, must be visiting as well. Their mother greeted them just as happily, and later, when Sanjuro and Takeo came back from training, they welcomed the newcomers just as enthusiastically. They were, of course, followed by the older Rengoku, who looked on at the family with a warm, if somewhat sad smile, although that sadness vanished when Hanako spoke of her training with flame breathing. Apparently one of her duties had been to stare at a fire and find different ways to describe aspects of it. She'd grown rather poetic when she spoke of flames in general. Apparently, though, she hadn't begun to go through some of the harsher aspects of training because of her age. She was 9 now and would begin some of that training when she turned 10. Nezuko couldn't help but be relieved that her sister wouldn't have to go through something equally as harsh as she'd had to go through at such a young age. Takeo, on the other hand, had apparently reached a point where he could go to the final selection. As soon as they knew no waxing moons would show up to said selection, of course, the entire corps was still wary of everything that had happened with her, Tanjiro and Mitsuri. Apparently Urikodaki did not think Sanjuro was ready for the final selection yet, though, and while a lot of that had to do with unlearning bad habits he'd gotten into without his brother or father's supervision, Nezuko could tell the boy was discouraged. However, he did seem to be more determined and stable than what she'd seen before, and he didn't have a problem voicing his opinions anymore. Or at least not as much. It was nice to see him grow, and she made a mental note to tell him how much he'd changed later. Shinazugawa didn't even bother to come inside, instead leaping to the roof of the house and staying there while the Kamado and Rengoku families ate. Higuro did come in, but sat away from everyone in the far corner, watching the warm interactions warily. He didn't seem comfortable in large groups, but Nezuko also got a sense of fascination from him, as if he couldn't quite comprehend the image before him. She did make a point to invite him over, but he declined, looking half longing and half terrified. She did not offer again that night. More than one person noted that Tanjiro wasn't eating, and once Rokuta and Shizuru had been put to bed, he sat in front of everyone else and explained everything. How he had finished transforming into a demon by using his power to save Shinazugawa from waxing one. How he had turned Shinazugawa into a demon to save his life. How neither of them could eat human food, etc. Nezuko took it from there, explaining what had happened with the 2 waxing moons who had come after them on their way back from the final selection, and how she was very likely resistant to demonic cells and the subsequent change now. Not that she wanted to test that, but it was something she felt her family should know. Then Tanjiro explained about Akaza, and that had been an awkward conversation, and how Iguro-san was accompanying his fellow pillars because letting 2 demons of that strength go off on their own was not something anyone was comfortable with. Once they finished, the assembled group sat in silence, seeming to digest that. Soon after, everyone retired to their beds, on their mother's insistence, but Nezuko was sure she wasn't the only one still awake and thinking late into the night. Eventually, she did drift off, and she hoped the others in the household did as well. XXX. The next day, they began training. Kenjiro, who had never trained in the flame style, seemed particularly excited to see what kind of training Rengoku SR decided to put him and the other slayers through. Once he'd finished with Hanako, leaving her to swing her sword 1,000 times, he uncovered the trench he dug and filled with wood. Then he started it on fire and told the 6 current slayers, perhaps a little too gleefully, to give him 1,000 push-ups over the flames. Inosuke took to this with relish. Zenitsu almost fainted. The rest of them nodded, determined, and began their chore. While they did so, Rengoku SR spoke of the inner flame and how one had to concentrate on that for any flame style. He talked about feeding one's energy to said flame and thus controlling the output of concentration and strength by the amount of energy one fed into it. It was a concept that Nezuko caught on to quickly, even as she struggled past 200 push-ups over the heat. At least she'd had the foresight to put her hair up. The next 2 weeks went on like that, pushing everyone to train as hard as they could and ending with Nezuko practically falling into bed every night. At least she wasn't the only one. The flame training seemed to tire out her fellow slayers as well. Even Shinazugawa came in at night and she'd seen him collapsed in a corner while heading to her own room, drained and so tired. A lot of that may have had to do with Tanjiro taking him and Naguro-san after dinner every other day for a couple of hours to train as well. Those tended to be the hours when everyone else finished up chores for the day, and while part of Nezuko envied them for getting an extra training, part of her most certainly did not. She didn't know what kind of training they did, but she suspected it was something to do with their demon abilities. Her guess was confirmed when they came in one night, just before bed, with Tanjiro exclaiming excitedly. Nezuko, from where she sat on her futon, merely turned an ear to listen. Of course you'd have a wind-based blood art. It makes so much sense. Every demon I've known who has been a demon slayer has had a blood art that complements their breathing style. Nezuko snorted, although he sounded both more tired and more upbeat than he had before. And how many demons that used to be demon slayers have you known? Exactly. A pause. Well, 3 if you include me. But I use the sun breathing style, and my blood art deals with flames and fire. Kokoshibo's, he practically spat the name, uses the moon breathing style, and his blood art is the ability to create, and to an extent control, blades much like his breathing style suggests. The third was someone I've run across a few times, but he doesn't always become a demon, so I'll leave it at that. But yeah. Have you warned Yubayashiki-sama about the potential defector? Iduro asked, tone accusing. Oh, no, I haven't. I'll do that tonight. Tanjiro responded with the sound of one fist hitting into the palm of his hand. In any case, I wonder why that is, he continued just seconds later, going back to the previous topic. Do demon transformations and breathing styles affect the same part of the human soul? Is that why breathing styles are far more effective against them? A snort from Nezuko. It just gives the human the ability and speed to actually keep up with most demons. It's the blades that makes killing demons possible. You're right, her brother responded almost immediately. I should be looking into the blades and sunlight. Nezuko smiled as she finished getting ready for the night, allowing the 3 pillars to walk by outside as they made their way to their own room, continuing to talk quietly, if excitedly. Her brother always had such a positive outlook. She hoped she could be that strong one day. XXX. Hanako wasn't really sure what to think about more or less everything. Her life had changed so drastically since that day. The day her elder brother woke up not acting like himself at all. They'd run away from, something, and then had ended up at Yurikodaki's after long, hard days and nights on the road. And then her brother had trained and left while Nezuko began training. And then the Rengokus had come and she'd volunteered to train under a different style. And that had been an adjustment. Rengoku-san apparently hadn't been one to cook or clean in quite a while, and he'd admitted that he'd never had a daughter before, that he had no clue how to take care of a girl. Eventually he'd hired some townspeople from a local village to come and help maintain the compound for a week out of the month, as he didn't want to pressure Oyakata-sama by requesting for Kakashi. They'd all been rather shocked and a bit scandalized when they'd found out that Rengoku-san had been teaching her swordplay. But none of them had dared speak against the head of the estate. And so she'd continued training. It had taken them a while to get into a pattern that worked, but eventually they had, and now she couldn't help but be glad she'd chosen to go and learn the flame style instead of the water style. She felt stronger than ever and was very proud of her progress, even knowing she had a long way to go. But she'd also missed so much, like her brother becoming a pillar and Nezuko going to the final selection, and then Tanjiro slowly becoming a demon. But being able to still act like his normal self with his memories intact, and he didn't eat humans and apparently could turn other people into demons too. It was just so much. Her family had written to her, of course, but they hadn't known everything, and even if they had, it was different actually seeing it. Seeing her brother look at her with bright red eyes that had kanji written in them, and smile with those fangs showing in his claws. She'd never actually come across a demon before now, and it was terrifying. And this was her brother in another pillar, and not actually actively trying to kill her. She had no idea how she would react when she faced a real demon, and so she wanted practice. So one day, a couple of weeks into training, she walked up to her brother after he'd come out of his own flame training. "Mai-chan," she said, as seriously as she could. He turned those bright red eyes on her in surprise and question. "Spar with me." Silence. He blinked. Sure. Why though?" he asked. She looked down, not wanting to hurt his feelings. He didn't like it when someone brought up his demon-ness. She didn't notice the others in the group turned to stare at him in shock. "I want practice," she finally went with. "I spar with Rengoku-san sometimes, but I want to see how well I'm doing compared to others." She looked back up, trying to seem firm and sure. He softened and leaned down a bit. "It's because I'm a demon, isn't it?" She stiffened and looked away again, feeling her face heat up. She didn't answer, but apparently that was answer enough. "I get it," he said, ruffling her hair. She felt the claws scrape against her scalp gently and had to withhold a shudder. This was Tanjiro, after all. And if Rengoku-san thinks it's okay. He faded off and turned to look at their teacher. The man looked thoughtful. "I haven't had time to train her as much as I would like since getting here, and sparring against another style would certainly be beneficial. If you can hold back to her level." Hanako hated that he had to stipulate that, but also understood that she needed to be patient with herself. Tanjiro nodded. "I can. In either style." Rengoku-san nodded firmly. "Then I approve." The youngest Kamado girl grinned. XXX. Hanako had sparred a little against Rengoku-sensei, but she knew sparring with her brother would be different. She just hadn't realized how different. Rengoku-sensei and Nai-san both showered her with praise when she did something right, although her sensei would sternly but gently correct her when she misstepped or where she could do something better. Tanjiro would simply encourage her to try again, completely convinced she would do it right the next time. And the next time. And the next time. But she found it so frustrating that, like Rengoku-sensei, he had absolutely no trouble outmatching her. Within minutes, she was breathing hard and working up a sweat, and she hadn't even come close to hitting him. Not that she thought her brother was any weaker than Rengoku-sensei, but Sensei told her that she needed to be patient, that comparing herself to a Hashira, former or not, was like comparing a sapling to a tree. Expecting that sapling to shade as much ground as a giant tree was ridiculous. That didn't stop her inability to land a hit frustrating. "You're doing so well, Hanako-chan," Tanjiro said as he dodged yet another of her swings. "You'd definitely be able to defeat me back when I sold charcoal. And I was 13 then." If he hadn't said it with such a genuine smile, his comment would have very much angered her. But it was Tanjiro and he meant it as a compliment. And it was. She was a girl, not even 10 years of age, and he was confident she could beat children much older. Still, not half an hour later, she found herself collapsed on the ground breathing hard with a grinning Tanjiro leaning over her and gushing about how good she was doing and how impressed he was. "I'm so proud of you, Hanako. In no time, you'll be as good as Rengoku-san, as both of them. They're amazing, and you will be too." That brought her up short. "Nai-san, have you seen Rengoku-san fight?" she asked through heavy breaths. That brought Tanjiro up short and he looked up at her sensei, who seemed to be focusing on her question just as intently as she had. "Well, yes, I've seen the current flame pillar fight. Akaza, actually, it was incredible. He saved so many lives that day." "What about Rengoku-sensei?" she asked, forcing herself to sit up. It already hurt. Tomorrow would not be pleasant. Tanjiro blinked and looked back up, almost apologetic. "No, I haven't." The former pillar caught onto where Hanako was going and smiled warmly down at her. "If you wanted a demonstration, sapling, why didn't you just say so?" She blushed a little as her teacher looked at her brother. "If you're amenable." Her brother looked very interested. "I am. Will you use your sun breathing style?" Tanjiro blinked, taken aback. "Sure," he said after a moment with a shrug. They proceeded to set boundaries behind which Hanako and the other demon slayers could watch. She was a little annoyed and thought the fight would be too far away. Until they moved. Sparks flashed as their swords met and she could barely follow them as they danced across the clearing. She could swear she actually saw flames rising from their attacks in the air their swords passed through. Different colors even. Rengoku-sensei's were a bright yellow-orange, while Nai-san's were a dark ruby red. There weren't actually flames, but the entire display just took her breath away, especially when Nai-san's sword ended at Rengoku-sensei's throat. It took several seconds for Hanako to catch her breath. So, that was what she needed to aspire to be. She knew she would never forget this day and, for once, began to look forward to the harsher training that would help her begin to achieve that level of skill. XXX. Shinjiro blinked as he looked into the eyes of the demon he'd just sparred with. The boy hadn't even pushed himself, such was his power. It reminded him again of the single time he'd seen Waxing One and he realized he hadn't understood this boy's strength at all. "Yield," the older man said, not willing to move with that sword to his throat. The boy grinned and stepped back, lowering his weapon and bowing, looking utterly sincere. "Thank you for the spar, Rengoku-san." The yellow-haired man nodded in affirmation as he rubbed his throat. "That was impressive. That was your sun style. I'm positive I saw some flame style in that." The boy's face practically lit up. "Yes, that's the original breathing form that all other forms are derived from." "Really?" the Rengoku head asked, surprised. "Interesting. Just where had he gotten that from? And was that the first style the family text spoke of?" He'd have to look into that. However, he'd noticed a couple of the moves had seemed a little off and he was curious as to the discrepancies. "If I could be so bold, I do think that while you use the style very well, you could use some tune-ups on some of the forms flame is derived from." The younger boy blinked, eyes widening in surprise. "You think so?" Shinjiro shrugged. "If what you say is true, and all other forms come from your original breathing form, there should be some crossover, correct?" "How do you know this style?" "I've never seen it before. It was passed down in my family for centuries as a ceremonial dance celebrating Hinokami." The older man's eyebrow raised in question. "As a dance?" Kamado nodded. "Not as a fighting form." "Well, no," the boy replied thoughtfully. "It would make sense that a dance would choose aesthetics over practicality," Shinjiro mused. It is likely that some of the form's offense was lost during those years. I never thought of that, Kamado admitted, but then his eyes lit up. Could you show me? Shinjiro smiled at the boy's eagerness. He wasn't entirely sure he was comfortable teaching a demon though. Why do you need to get stronger? He asked. The boy's smile faded a little and he looked down. Kokoshibo beat me. I need to find a way to get stronger to never let that happen again. Waxing one. Oh, the Rengoku had completely understood that. He had, after all, seen the demon in action. He'd been one of the few in history to see such and survive. And, knowing someone was on their side who could stand against that monster. Very well. The first discrepancy I noticed. You want to visit the different cultivators? Obanai asked Kamado, frowning. The time traveler nodded firmly. Haven't you already? He asked. In one of your previous lives. Well, yes, but that was just for physical training. Now I want to go for breathing training. That made no sense. Don't you already have the original and supposedly strongest form? He distinctly remembered that being in the information they'd received about him. Yes, the demon nodded. But it was a dance passed down in my family for generations, not used as a fighting style. My father made charcoal to sell during the winter and we grew silkworms in warmer months. He didn't come from a samurai family. His ancestors just happened to know the original creator of breathing well. Obanai stared at him, blinking. Because what? That sounds convoluted. The boy rubbed the back of his head. It kind of is. But the thing is, I was sparring with Rengoku-san and he recognized some of the forms in my son breathing style from his own. He thought they looked a little off, so we went over those that he recognized and fixed little things. Hand placement and footwork mainly. I can already tell a difference in those forms, so I wanted to go to the others and see if they could find discrepancies in the style. Obanai frowned, thinking about that. Each style was based off of a different aspect they focused almost exclusively on. Lightning for speed, stone for strength and power, quick multiple strikes to swarm for wind, dexterity, and movement for flame, defense and steady attacks for water. True, each form had their exceptions, but each style focused on one particular aspect and pushed that aspect to the extreme, then filled in gaps as best as they could to make each style more well-rounded. Combining the strengths of all of those into one style. What a terrifying thought. I've already had Sanmi look over my forms, and he found some places I could improve as well. I'm going to speak with Urokodaki-sensei tonight, but I'm writing Yubayashiki-sama now to get permission, and I wanted to know if you wanted to come along or if I should request another pillar. The serpent pillar actually thought about that. Honestly, he didn't see what the point in escorting them at all really was. He knew Kamado could take both him and Shinazugawa easily, without using whatever weird control he had over the other demon even. The wind pillar had already been a difficult fight before he turned into a demon, now that he had a blood art on top of his wind style, and they'd even gotten him a new blade, so he could learn to use both in tandem. The only good Obanai was doing here was training to get stronger himself. He withheld a sigh and scowled instead. If Yubayashiki-sama requests I go with you, I will, but I don't think it's necessary. Kamado cocked his head to one side, confused. Why not? Obanai considered telling him the actual truth, but figured that would just give him a big head. He also didn't want to deal with that kind of embarrassment. I'm here to train with Urokodaki. Leaving before he says won't help me. Well, it had the benefit of being true. He swore he could see sparkles enter the demon's eyes. You're right, he said, dropping one fist into the palm of his other hand. Your dedication is amazing. No, seriously, what was up with this kid? Because Obanai didn't think it was a demon thing. Scratch that, he was sure it wasn't a demon thing. He didn't think it was a human thing, to be honest. People weren't born that earnest. I'm sure you'll manifest your mark soon. His mark, like Kamado's mark, like Shinazugawa's mark, like Kenroji's mark. Have I manifested it before? He asked, trying not to sound too sheepish or curious and probably failing miserably. Yeah, you did. You and Mitsuri both helped in that final battle against Muse in my first loop. He contemplated not asking his next question, but he had to know. And did we get together afterwards? Was that why Kamado seemed so certain about the two of them? Instead of a resounding yes, Kamado's face went blank and he didn't answer. That raised warning bells in Obanai's head and he opened his mouth to push, but the other boy spoke first. You died. Both of you. The serpent pillar's mouth snapped shut. On his shoulder, Kaburamaru hissed in displeasure and worry. Kamado's eyes lost focus as he went on. I didn't get much mentally from Musen, thank the kami, but I distinctly remember two separate viewpoints regarding that fight, and I don't see a way either one of you could have survived it. He looked down. It's something I'd like to prevent this time. His gaze moved back up to meet Obanai's as he went on. It's one reason I'm encouraging you to make that omiai. Mitsuri has only ever wanted to be accepted unconditionally by the person she marries, accepted for all of who she is. I know you can and will be that person. I know you care for her and she makes you happy, and I'd like to see you both get that happiness before. He faded off and looked away. Just in case, he muttered. It was actually refreshing to see the boy acknowledge something that wasn't sunshine and roses. A little terrifying, but refreshing. Still, his little speech brought up a couple of questions. Why? The serpent pillar asked. Kamado's attention snapped back to him, looking puzzled. So Obanai clarified. Why me? Why her? You sound like you supported us before this loop. Did you know us that well? Why do you support that? To be fair, Obanai wasn't used to support and encouragement like this. It didn't make sense. Kamado shook his head. I didn't know either of you extremely well, but, well, you were my comrades then, you're my comrades now. I'd like my comrades to find happiness. The world can only benefit from more happiness in it. The serpent pillar just stared at the demon boy in front of him for several seconds. Someone wanted him to be happy, just because he knew them. How strange. And wasn't it sad that such encouragement was a foreign concept to him? This was the kind of support a family was supposed to give, right? Or maybe this was more of a friend thing. He didn't know, but that seemed closer. I will take your words into account, he finally muttered, referring to the Omei. Thank you, Kamado said happily, then turned to run back to the house. I'll write Yubaeshiki-sama now. Good luck training. Obanai could only stare after him, wondering how that boy seemed to upend all logic with his sunshine smile and sincerity. XXX. Takeo looked at the ground, shuffling his sandal-clad feet in the dirt of the road leading to Yurikodaki-sensei's house. Beside him, his siblings crowded around their older brother and sister, clamoring for their attention as the younger ones asked them why he had to leave and when he would be back. Takeo, however, just kept quiet. We'll be back to visit soon, Nezuko promised, patting everyone's head. Rokuta had latched himself to her leg, tears and snot streaming down his face as he turned his puppy dog eyes up at his sister. Takeo could tell she wanted to give in to his silent plea to stay, but she remained strong. He could respect that. Exactly, Tanjiro agreed, but we have to go to keep you all safe. I have to train elsewhere to get special instruction, while Nezuko, Inosuke-san and Zenitsu-san have an assignment. Takeo glanced up at him and noted his brother's attention turning in his direction. He looked down again. Then he felt a warm hand on his forehead. Hey, his brother said, nudging his head so he would look up again. What's wrong? Takeo opened his mouth to say, but realized that there was so much and it would be exhausting and tiresome and embarrassing to explain. So he snapped his mouth closed and looked down again. Nothing. Doesn't seem like nothing, Tanjiro pointed out in that too soft, too understanding voice of his. Takeo couldn't really resist that, so he gave in and tried to put his thoughts into words. I thought you'd accompany me to the final selection next month, he muttered. Since Mom and Yurikodaki-sensei decided having her and me going at once would be a bad idea. It had surprised him, really. His mom was better than him, as much as he hated to admit it. Then going before her seemed weird. He had to admit, he was a little scared to go, and having his brother there would help immensely, even if he couldn't actually help. They decided to start it up again. Tanjiro asked, sounding both concerned and pleased. Well, there will be other Hashira there to make sure you make it through just fine. Besides, I have faith in you. You'll do great. Takeo shook his head. He was disappointed that his siblings were leaving already, but the idea of going to the final selection alone after he thought he'd at least be able to walk there with Tanjiro, especially after such a dangerous demon had been seen in the area. Will they know me by sight? He asked. His brother blinked in surprise. Who? Takeo bit his lip and looked down. The demons. They're after our family. What if waxing one? He faded off and Tanjiro continued to stare at him for several seconds. You have a point. I don't know if they'd recognize you on sight. I don't think so, but I'll send a letter to Yubaeshiki-sama and speak with Yurikodaki-sensei before we go. If you need someone to accompany you, you have one former Hashira and two current Hashira who will definitely be around then. He looked up at the house where the three people mentioned sat in discussion with Rengoku-sensei. Takeo followed his gaze and relaxed a bit. It wasn't as good as having his brother there, but it was better than him walking to the final selection and running into the same being that had almost killed his brother, or those who had almost turned his sister into a demon. Finally, he nodded gratefully. Thank you, Oniai-san. And here you go. Their mother's voice broke through as she came up behind the group, 3 bentos tied neatly in her hands. Your lunches for today. Thank you, Aka-san, Nezuko said enthusiastically as she took them and then handed one box each to the yellow-haired boy and the boar-headed boy respectively. Tanjiro watched them for a moment, looking both satisfied and longing. Takeo felt for him. He didn't know what he'd do if he couldn't eat his mom's bentos anymore. Then the oldest Kamado sibling deliberately turned and made his way over to the house. Takeo followed, a little nervous. "I can't believe they're letting you go off on your own," the white-haired demon muttered just loud enough for Takeo to hear as they walked up to the group of older men. He huffed, wanting to punch the guy. "There just aren't enough Hashira to look after me when they have their own missions and training," Tanjiro said with a shrug. Anyway, Takeo brought up a problem that I think needs to be addressed. They went on to explain Takeo's fears and, thankfully, the Hashira listened intently. "I'll definitely try to be at the final selection, but that depends on Yubayashiki-sama," he said. "But at the very least, Urokudaki-sensei, I was hoping you or one of my fellow Hashira would accompany him, just in case. I know it's traditional to let the potential slayer go on their own, but these aren't normal circumstances." Urokodaki-sensei said thoughtfully. "Or I could accompany him on the way back to the Rengoku estate," the former flame pillar volunteered. Everyone turned to look at him in surprise. "That would be very far out of your way," Urokodaki-sensei pointed out. "But worth it," the yellow-haired man countered. "We'll have to stay a little longer, but if you are amenable, Urokodaki-san, I think it would be beneficial for everyone." The man in the Tengu mask was silent for a couple of seconds before he nodded. "Yes, that is a good idea." "Great. I'll let you all work it out," Tanjiro said before turning to Takeo. "See, we'll take care of you as best we can. All of us." With that, he ruffled his brother's hair. Takeo stepped back with a scowl on his face as he batted Tanjiro's hands away. After a moment, however, his frown melted into a soft smile. "Thank you, Oniai-san." "Always, Takeo," he replied, drawing his brother into one last hug. "Genjiro, let's go," a rough voice called out. Tanjiro turned to look at his three traveling companions. "You'll do great, Takeo," he assured once more before he turned to meet with the group he'd be traveling with for a short while. He waved behind him as everyone bid their goodbyes. Takeo waved his own hand, face set hard as his determination to live up to his brother's faith in him solidified. He'd have to keep training hard to make sure he was more than ready for the final selection. "Senjiro-san, let's train," he said enthusiastically to the blonde boy who had been leaning against the house, watching the entire exchange quietly. It wasn't unusual, he did everything quietly. "Eh?" the boy said as Takeo dragged him off. XXX. The sun had just overshot its peak and the fields and forests around them rang with life. It was lovely and felt wonderful to not have the entire clearing fall silent as Tanjiro stepped into it. Either the wildlife of the daylight didn't comprehend the presence of a demon or the insects and birds flitting through the nearby treetops didn't care. Either way, he loved it, loved every second of sunlight and natural noise, so different from his usual experiences. "Be safe, Nai-san." Nezuko's quiet voice reached his ears and he turned to look down at her. They'd reached the fork in the road where they would need to part to go on their separate missions. The older sibling smiled softly. "Always, Nezuko. You be safe too." He paused and looked up at the two demon slayers who had once been his best friends. It hurt to see them still wary of him, not like they had been, but the friendship he remembered and had cherished was gone. He doubted it could come back at this moment. That didn't mean he didn't care for them. So he leaned forward and whispered to her, "Make sure you take care of those two, keep them alive." He knew very well that Zenitsu at least could hear him, but that didn't bother him. She huffed a little, but her eyes sparkled warmly. "I'm working on it. By the time we're done, Inosuke will know some manners and Zenitsu will understand his worth." She whispered her answer back, giggling. Zenitsu shuffled uncomfortably. "And have their back in battles," Tanjiro went on. "They can hold their own, but you're all fighting together for a reason." Nezuko blinked and then nodded. "I promise, Nai-san." "Oi, Nezuko, let's go. I wanna fight a demon." The younger Kamado sighed and shook her head, though she smiled fondly. Coming, she gave her brother one last hug before turning and heading off with them. "When I get back, I'll be stronger than you. Just watch," Inosuke yelled at Tanjiro, pointing at him dramatically. The demon in question grinned. "I look forward to it." Inosuke nodded in satisfaction, then turned and stomped off in a way only Inosuke could. Tanjiro watched them go until they'd gone quite a ways down the road, his heart both light and heavy. He missed his friends. He missed them so much his heart hurt. But this was worth it. He had his family back and alive and he was well on his way to defeating Kokoshibo. Then he could start on training to defeat Muzan. And he'd also gotten permission to turn any demon he came across into his own demon if he felt it beneficial. With a sigh, he finally turned and began to head towards the lightning cultivator's residence. He'd never met Zenitsu's Gramps and was looking forward to it. He hoped the man could help him with his speed. He'd already spoken with Urokodaki-sensei and Seini about their relevant portions of his style, and both had found areas to correct once they studied his movements. Samey with far more colorful language than the former water pillar, but he would take it. He'd fixed so many problems already, and he could tell that his forms were better, faster, easier to flow through, and definitely more deadly. He wasn't entirely sure what to do about the stone pillar though. Yubaeshiki-sama had asked him to let him know when Tanjiro would be heading over to train there so he could order Genya somewhere else. Tanjiro sighed. Did he always have to be on the bad side of one Shinazugawa brother or the other? Or both? In every life, he couldn't remember when he'd been on good terms with both of them. Had it ever happened? He didn't think so. Was it even possible? He hoped so. The problem was, even if Hajime-san wanted to help him, he was blind. Could he tell with sound or feel or something like that if Tanjiro's movements were off? Well, if not, he'd just have to take what he could get and find other ways to get stronger. And he would. Muzan would die this loop. He'd make sure of it. XXX. Muzan looked down at Kokushibo blankly. He knelt in Caesar with the other Kazuki on the floor of the Infinity Mansion in front of him, as they had for the last several minutes while he contemplated their position. His highest ranked demon had made more or less a full recovery, but it wasn't enough. He had all 6 waxing moons again. But as powerful as Nakaim was, she didn't have the kind of attacking power he needed against the demon slayers. It was too evenly matched right now, which meant they were somehow catching up. That infuriated him. He either needed to take down their Hashira or build up his own ranks. He didn't want to pit his Kazuki against marked Hashira right now, though. Most of them could defeat said Hashira, but he hadn't gotten where he had by taking unnecessary risks. He'd only do so if the potential reward significantly outweighed that risk. He looked over his remaining Kazuki. Of course, if he sent them against former Hashira, the human body did tend to deteriorate. And while he couldn't always have complete control over the memories a potential demon lost in the turn, he could influence it. It usually helped to have a willing, or at least semi-willing, prospect, but he needed strength right now. If that meant forcefully taking unwilling servants, then so be it. And if he could get the Kamado kid or any of his siblings, so much the better. He was positive now that the family would be able to conquer the sun for him. So, if he could hit 2 birds with 1 stone. Kokushibo, if you would like to get back in my good graces, I have an assignment for you and Nakaim. Kaigaku wasn't quite sure what to think when Gramps, no, Sensei, sent him a crow asking for his return. He didn't know what to expect at all when he arrived at the familiar orchard he hadn't seen for almost a year and a half. He also didn't know quite what to think of this place. He had some good memories here, but some that he'd rather forget too, mostly dealing with a certain annoying, yellow-haired wimp of a brat. At least he wouldn't run into said brat now, thank the kami. The old man happened to be tending some of the peach trees and caught sight of him as he wandered down the road. Kaigaku, thank you for coming so promptly. You're at least a couple hours earlier than him. Immediately Kaigaku's face fell into a frown. Him? He asked, voice strained. It had better not be who he thought it was. If he saw a single hair of the brat, he'd turn right around and walk away. Sensei just shook his head, running a hand through what was left of his gray hair. A Hashira. That surprised the younger demon slayer. Hashira? The old man nodded grimly. The demon one. Kaigaku just stared at the old man. He'd heard rumors, of course, but he hadn't thought they were actually true. There's really a demon pillar? He asked quietly, stunned. Gramps, Sensei nodded in solidarity. He claims to know the original breathing form that all other forms stemmed from. But the katas must have degraded over the years because he says some things have been lost. But if he studies under every style, he should be able to regain the true form. Kaigaku's brain was not working and had yet to catch up. There was just too much. Why are we working with one of those monsters? He found himself yelling. The old man sighed. He's been vetted by multiple Hashira and apparently was turned into a demon over a period of years due to some sort of blood art. Kaigaku felt himself pale. Blood arts can turn people into demons now? He asked hoarsely. Gramps shrugged. This is the first and only time I've heard of it. Well, his entire life just got more terrifying. And that wasn't a low bar. And he's a Hashira. He was before he became a demon and has been under constant supervision until now. No one has seen him even touch a drop of human blood or so much as a hair with the intent to eat. Supposedly, he sleeps in place of eating. Constant supervision. For how long? Kaigaku asked, and he wasn't panicking. He wasn't, and he would destroy anyone who said otherwise. Almost 2 years at this point. By multiple Hashira. Kaigaku stared at his sensei for several seconds before shaking his head. This had to be a trick. He could have slipped away. I've been assured he didn't. He shook his own head slowly. Believe me, Kaigaku, I have my own reservations, but Yubaeshiki-sama asked me to help him, so I will. However, he paused and glanced down the empty road. No, wait, they were fine because demons couldn't come out in the daytime, right? The old man continued. I wanted you here just in case. I have a couple of trainees here now and I need to make sure they're protected. I know you've risen several ranks since you left and, well, there are a few others I would trust more. Kaigaku felt himself relax a little at that, and then straightened his spine haughtily. Well, I have become rather skilled as a Tsuchino. Did the old man just roll his eyes at Kaigaku? We'll see shortly, brat. But there are still some things you have to know. The younger man pushed his anger down with more than a little effort, but still managed it. Barely. Like what? He asked. Like the fact that he can walk in the sunlight. Kaigaku froze. What? XXX. This had to be against some rule somewhere. Nezuko was sure of it and made plans to send a letter to Yubayashiki-sama himself, and then Tanjiro, and then Shinobu-san, and then Kanroji-san, and then her mother and Yurikodaki-sensei. Mainly her mother though. She'd like to see what they all thought of a pillar practically kidnapping her and her companions. And he'd been trying to kidnap Ai-san instead, who had no experience in this kind of mission whatsoever. This certainly had to be against the rules, and not the Yuzui-san's stupid rules of him being some sort of kami. She'd never heard anything more ridiculous in her life. At least she and Zenitsu were on the same page there. Now she huffed along angrily, dressed up in the ugliest makeup she'd ever had the misfortune of laying her eyes on as the sound Hashira led them to the red light district. At least she'd gotten an explanation behind the makeup. He'd explained it when she'd tried to take over after seeing his disastrous attempts because at least she'd had some experience. If you look pretty when we get there, it will draw too much attention and bring representatives from houses we don't want to be a part of which I will have to turn down, which will just draw more attention. She wondered why he seemed to have no problem drawing attention to himself, then, with his strange eye tattoo or sleeveless uniform, bands around his biceps or his light-colored hair. Maybe he'd simply made himself into a walking distraction. If so, it certainly worked. At least he'd known enough about makeup to cover that tattoo for this mission. He almost looked respectable now. Almost. That wasn't very nice. She realized her thoughts were spiraling with her anger and took a deep breath to calm down. She didn't like Yuzui-san or the mission they were on very much, but she also understood worrying about one's family. She understood what it was like to know someone else was in danger and not be able to do anything about it. That was the only reason she was going along with this. This was such a bad idea. She really should have asked Tanjiro if he happened to know about this mission sooner, but she'd wanted to fulfill it on her own. She'd been blinded by her own pride and ambition at the moment Yuzui-san had asked them. That had been before she'd sat down and thought about it and about how badly this could all go. But by then she'd already accepted the mission, and writing a letter had been the only other plan she could think of that hadn't been tried already, according to Yuzui-san. Sure, he said he'd be there to watch their backs and that he would pull them out, but wasn't this the same mission his wives had gone on? The one where they had disappeared. Admittedly, they weren't actually supposed to fight the demons once they found them, but if the demon recognized them and attacked first. She was immensely grateful Ai hadn't actually been kidnapped and taken on this mission. There you go, Sumiko. The sound pillar's deep voice drew her out of her thoughts. It took her a moment to realize he had been speaking to her. Right? That was her new name. I have entrusted you to the Takedo house. He gestured to the large building he'd walked them up to just a couple of minutes ago. For a moment, her gut swam. The idea of having to live her life here and never seeing her family again. No, she would be fine. They would take care of everything later. Any debts or whatnot would be set to right and she had an act to play. So she bowed, ignoring Zenitsu being practically wrangled by Yuzui-san. It was sweet that he was so concerned. Still, she'd agreed to this, so she would follow through. Please take care of me, she said softly. I'll work hard. Oh, what a polite child, the woman said with a smile. Come in and I will show you to your room. With that, Nezuko walked inside, turning to look at Yuzui-san and her other two companions one last time. Then she took a deep breath, turned, and followed the woman into the building. XXX. Kaigaku didn't know what to expect from this Hashira demon who could walk in the sun. But it wasn't what he got. He could honestly only stare in incredulity when the guy showed up the day after the Tsuguko had. First, he was short. Not as short as Sensei, but still not very tall. Second, he was young, like Zenitsu young, and already a Hashira. What the actual was that because he was a demon. Third, he was, well, kind, and happy and polite and very much unlike any other demon he'd ever heard about or met. It made no sense. How could this guy be the demon pillar who had come to train with Sensei? Then he saw Kamado and Sensei spar and his mouth fell open. His jaw stayed there until well after the bout had finished. The kid could keep up with Gramps, with whatever style he was using. No one could keep up with Sensei, not as far back as the lightning Nezuko could remember. However, despite this, the old man still held his own, and if it weren't for his leg, he may very well have won. That speed was why Kaigaku was so proud of his style. Once he'd heard of other styles, he'd still wanted to keep learning lightning breathing. Strength meant a lot, sure, but speed was what really won fights in his experience. For the first time, he actually considered that the kid had spoken the truth about his style being the origin of all styles, and he could almost see flames from his sword, where he tended to see sparks from Gramps' swings. Sun breathing, huh? Then he dismissed it. Lightning was superior. End of story. This guy was just good enough to use his style well. That was all. He did have to wonder how the boy got so good at such a young age though. When the mock battle ended with Kamado's blade at Sensei's neck and the old man's sword in no position to strike back, Sensei laughed. I see what you mean. That is certainly an interesting style, but I did see some areas for improvement. Let's get started. It was kind of awe-inspiring how quickly the demon won over Gramps. No, Sensei. Stupid Zenitsu, getting him thinking that about the old man, just like the yellow-haired brat had. However, his apparent age and his ability to win the old man over seemed to be the only two traits he had in common with Zenitsu. He was soft-spoken, polite, firm and steady, willing to work hard and didn't seem to be afraid of, well, anything, except Kaigaku, which was weird. Okay, it was more like the guy was wary of him, that Nezuko couldn't figure out why. As much as he hated to admit it, it certainly wasn't his strength. The demon could beat Sensei and, unfortunately, Kaigaku couldn't. He'd even tried. They'd sparred after Kamado had left to begin on Sensei's exercises that first day. He didn't see much of the demon after that. Not that that fact bothered him. What did bother him was the fact that he was stuck training the new recruits while Sensei focused on the Hashira. By the end of the week, Kaigaku was ready to throw all of the useless brats back where they'd come from. Why did Sensei think they had any talent or reason to be in the Demon Slayer's corps? He didn't know. He also didn't know whether it was the Hashira's supposedly superior demon body or Kamado's fierce dedication. But by that point, he'd gotten through all of Sensei's exercises that had taken Kaigaku and any other student he'd known years to accomplish, which meant they were only waiting on a storm to throw him out into. That would be his final test, to outrun a lightning bolt, as it had been for all lightning students. It would then turn into an exercise to see how many bolts he could dodge. Probably a lot. Kaigaku really wasn't jealous of or angry at or resentful of the demon in their midst, and he hadn't tried to avoid the kid like he would have Zenitsu. It was a mutual wariness, that was all, which was why Kamado coming up to him the day of the next storm with a strange expression and what looked like a glass bottle in his hand took him by surprise. He was so focused on the guy approaching him at all that it took him a moment to realize he was holding a small, glass bottle. Once he did, though, he had to do a double take. He had filled it with, was that blood? Kaigaku may or may not have frozen at that point, unsure of what to do when the guy held the bottle out for him to see for a moment, then wrapped it in a thick cloth. Here, he said with a smile. Unlike all the other smiles Kaigaku had seen, it looked forced. The older boy looked with trepidation at the wrapped object. What is that? A vial of my blood. I'm not sure how long it will last, but it should be far longer than human blood. Kaigaku blinked, incredulous and disgusted. Why would I want that? The boy cocked his head to one side, as if weighing what he should say. Finally, he settled on, I've become a progenitor stronger than Muzan, well, at least when it comes to this. He muttered that last half of the sentence while the lightning Nezuko gaped, then returned to his normal volume. This blood can turn anyone into a demon. He cringed as he continued, my demon. And I mean anyone, whether they're already a demon or not. So if someone gets turned into a demon, or if you come across a demon you can't conquer, or even if you're on the verge of death, well, it will solve a lot of problems at the expense of making other, hopefully more manageable problems. Why, another cringe, demons are just that initially, demons. They will attack humans mindlessly, so this is a last resort, and I have to stress that. But so far all demons I've transformed have gotten their faculties and all their memories back quickly. It's, well, better than the alternative. The Hashira just seemed to get more and more uncomfortable as the conversation progressed while Kaigaku became more and more horrified. Once the boy finished, he stepped back, looking at the outheld arm with open disgust. Then neither one of them moved for a while. Finally, the demon sighed. Yubayashiki-sama asked me to start handing these out. I'm not entirely happy about it and I don't like this at all, but it's better than someone dying or being turned into one of Muzan's demons. He spat the Demon King's name with enough vitriol that it put Kaigaku on edge and he tensed, ready to flee or fight. Thankfully, the boy didn't so much as take a step forward. Instead, he shook his head, then lifted his arm a little higher. Just, if you do get turned into a demon and happen to remember this, drink it away from Muzan or any waxing moons. Otherwise, put it where it won't get broken and use it as a last resort. Nezuko felt his mouth move up and down silently for several seconds before he gulped and nodded, feeling sick as he took the small bundle. Yeah, Kamado said with a nod that looked about as uncomfortable as Kaigaku felt. Please just be cautious. With that and one more nod, he turned and stomped away. A couple of hours later, he and Kamado dashed around in the middle of the storm, trying to dodge as many lightning bolts as possible. In the pouring rain, they both came in wet, cold, and successful. It was nice to see how far he'd come as a lightning breather. He still hadn't managed to get the first form down, but he had managed to dodge every single lightning bolt. You'll get that form down soon, Sensei said with a smile as he handed Kaigaku some tea. Then he complimented Kamado and explained that his training was complete, but if he wanted to stick around and make sure he'd fully incorporated it into his style for a week or two, that would be fine. Then he handed him tea. Then the kid drank the tea. What? Demons can have tea? He asked, incredulous. Kamado just smiled at him, a bright, sunshine smile that made him look even less threatening than when Kaigaku had first seen him. Yes, although not too much. He really didn't know what to make of this guy, and that ticked him off, so he just let out a chi and went back to drinking his own tea. XXX. Tenjin stared down at the street below, contemplating what had just happened. Nezuko had come to meet him with Hashibara. The latter had reported a definite demon in the house he'd been sold to while the former hadn't come across anything. They'd waited for the third boy, but then Tenjin had informed them that Zenitsu had gone missing. Kamado hadn't taken that well. To be fair, the boar-headed kid hadn't either, but that girl had a temper on her that would rival his wife's. Then he'd basically apologized for putting them in terrible positions because he really had. He'd just thought that they'd be young enough to go under the radar. They wouldn't be targets like his wives had been. Or, that had been his thought process, but now, suddenly, he was very glad he hadn't brought the younger girl he'd initially tried to recruit from Kacho's. And the idea that the boy had gone missing. He could just imagine what his wives would think of that when he saw them and they found out. Nakio would rage and yell, Suma would burst into tears, but the worst would be Hinatsuru. She would just stare at him with that sad, disbelieving look that bordered on disappointment so deep it may as well stem from betrayal. To be fair, wasn't that what he'd done? He'd betrayed his better judgment and put more people, children, in danger to try and get his wives back. He'd told the kids to run, that he suspected a waxing moon, that from now on he would move on his own. He'd been about to step away when Nezuko had stood up angrily. You wait right there. She yelled at him with such authority he'd actually frozen in surprise. You honestly think we're just going to run like that? When our friend is missing, you may count him as dead, but we sure don't. Beside her, Hashibara nodded emphatically. Besides, I know what we're going up against. I've seen waxing moons before. They gave my brother a hard time and I know the kind of power we're going to see. Now that we're here, you think we'll just back down? That we'll just leave you here? Not a chance. He blinked, still shocked at her insubordination, and his opinion of her raised significantly if she was so loyal to the demon slayers as to stay to help him, someone she most certainly did not like. Then he shook his head. You should know that you'll just get in my way if you stay. I've trained against a waxing moon, she insisted, walking up to him with her fists balled at her sides. She reminded him of Hinatsuru but with a more volatile temper under her steadfast determination. Have you? His protests died on his lips. This is too much. Your children, he finally said, exasperated. Demon slayers or not. He made sure he hadn't spoken loud enough for those on the street or in the nearby houses to hear, but it was getting difficult to not raise his voice. He was a Hashira. Then maybe you should have thought of that before you dragged us here in the first place. She shot right back, glaring up at him. He cringed, unable to squash his guilt at that. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath and calmed down significantly. After a moment, she opened her eyes again, still glaring, and asked in a steady voice, Did you think to ask my brother about this? Do you even know which Kazuki we're going up against? Tenjin froze. It hadn't honestly occurred to him that this might be a mission her brother would even know about. He'd been a Hashira, sure, but Tenjin usually took care of undercover missions unless said mission called for something specific one of the other pillars could bring to the table. He'd read about each Kazuki, what they looked like, how to take them down, etc. But he'd never thought to ask about the situation that had brought such information to Kamado. Hadn't he infiltrated the Kazuki to get this information? But that had been after several resets, according to him. So, how much had he known beforehand? That was a very large oversight on his part, and it may very well kill them all. This was his fault. No, he answered slowly. It didn't occur to me to do so. He was a demon in most of his lives. Nezuko shot back. Then she visibly forced herself to relax, taking several more breaths to calm down. What are you two talking about? Hashibara asked angrily. They didn't have time to explain it to him, so again, he ignored the boy. If they survived this, he could make arrangements to explain to the kid later. Did you at least send off the letter I left with you yesterday, as I asked? Nezuko pressed. He frowned but nodded. It had been against his better judgment as he hadn't really waited for clearance to come in and find his wives, even if he had technically gotten clearance for the mission when his wives had initially infiltrated. But the Kamado girl had been just as insistent then as she was now. Such a headstrong girl. He could appreciate that sort of flamboyance. I did, he replied truthfully. Yesterday. She nodded again. Good. Someone should arrive soon, then. Wait, what? He knew he shouldn't have sent that letter off to Yubayashiki-sama. Even if it took only a couple of hours for the crow to fly there, Oyakata-sama would have to approve a mission, and then find someone to come and find us, and that's if anyone of rank could come, he retorted. She seemed to think about that. Good, maybe she'd. But I also asked him to forward the letter on to Kenroji-san, Shinobu-san, my brother and my mother. She'll undoubtedly tell Urokodaki-sensei. I don't know if the Kasugai crow will reach my brother in time. It will depend on if he's on the road or not and if the crow can find him in time. However, I am positive it will reach Urokodaki-sensei's. He won't have anyone to send and he won't be able to come himself if he's training recruits, Tenjin said, getting annoyed now. She just shook her head. You misunderstand. My mother will make sure someone comes. If you think that my brother or I are stubborn or determined, you've obviously never met her. We just need to hold out that long. And so, until then, or we get confirmation of Zenitsu's body, we're staying. Yeah, Hashibara yelled loudly in agreement. Both Kamado and Tenjin turned to shush him. He seemed confused, but didn't speak up again, so the sound pillar turned his attention back on the girl in front of him. Besides, we need the money to pay off our supposed debts, she finished, crossing her arms with a huff. For a moment, he did not see Kamado Nezuko, but Hinetsuru. She'd reminded him of his wife before, but with the stance she took and that defiant gaze, she could almost be the woman's doppelganger. He couldn't say no to that. But he couldn't put them in danger either. Perhaps he could mitigate damage, then. You'll just stay no matter what I order you to do, he said softly. The children both nodded firmly. Very well. You may continue on at your houses, but the moment you have a problem, get out. Especially if we'll receive backup. Here, he took out 2 envelopes and handed one to each of them. Give that to the head of your respective houses or someone who will get that money to them. That should help you work more freely. If you can't find anything in the next 4 hours, leave. That is my condition. Otherwise, get my attention. Where will you be? Kamado asked, looking back up from the envelope to him. Around. If you run into a demon, make enough noise. Be flamboyant. I will find you. Both of them nodded firmly at him. Now he could only hope that they would follow through on their word. But honestly, Tenjin had a bad feeling. Whatever this whole thing had built to would go down tonight. He was sure of it. And if we truly cannot do anything, we will leave, Kamado assured him. Wait, what? Hashibara asked angrily and loudly. They both shushed him again. You have your orders. Now, go, Tenjin said firmly. Then he pushed off the roof tiles and sped over the buildings. He had a house master to interrogate. XXX. Urokodaki Sakonji was not afraid of much. Of losing his students prematurely to demons, yes. Of the demons finding him and taking away his new student's family, yes. But not much else. He'd never really feared death himself, which was why a sudden strike of killing intent had him straightening and searching around for a demon. It took him a moment to realize he didn't smell a demon. He smelled no new scents. Urokodaki-san, a soft, pleasant voice said from behind him. So why did it strike fear into his heart? Slowly, he turned around in the clearing he'd been cutting wood in, but only became more confused when he saw Kai come walking up to him, a smile on her face and a letter in her hand. Kai, he said slowly. Hadn't they gotten past the honorifics by now? At least when he wasn't teaching her swordplay. I just got a letter from Nezuko. It seems she's been kidnapped. Sakonji's heart almost stopped. Not again. But wait, then why had she been able to send a letter? Kai must have sensed the confusion because she continued. She was taken by a pillar who said he had a mission for her and her fellow slayers. In the red light district. My 14-year-old daughter. To the red light district. I recall Tanjiro saying something about going to the red light district after a Kazuki, and she still seemed just as angry about that too. Not at her son for saying anything, but at the situation. Likely, yes, I do, too, Sakonji agreed, his face paling. That had been a waxing moon too. What were the odds that this was the same Kazuki and the same mission? This could go very badly. Kai just nodded and continued. Nezuko thinks something is suspicious as they are apparently going after some shinobi who have disappeared, likely due to demons. It's supposed to be an undercover mission. I didn't know you or anyone had trained her for undercover missions, so surely this must be an oversight on the pillar's part. Right, this couldn't possibly be following the core rules. He gulped. I'll write you by Eshiki-sama. Oh, no need. He has written me and told me he had yet to actually review that particular mission. He doesn't know if he has anyone to send in, though, especially since it's likely a Kazuki they're going up against. So the killing intent was coming from her. She could have been a swordswoman, easily. He suggested someone here could go after them. Well, Sakonji certainly couldn't, not when he had students to train, but he did have 2 other pillars here who had finished their training. I'll go ask Aguro-san and Shinazugawa-san. What a splendid idea. Perhaps I should go too. I would like to meet this Yuzui-san. And suddenly Sakonji wasn't entirely sure the man would survive the encounter. They needed their pillars. You aren't quite ready to go into the field. You haven't even gone through the final selection. It looks like I'll be going to the next one with Takeo then. She replied with a bright smile. I will leave instructions with the children for the week I'm gone. It's only Shidru and Rokuta staying behind. I'm sure you can look after them by yourself. This was happening, whether he wanted it to or not. He realized he couldn't stop her, and she'd already cut a boulder. So he sighed and nodded. Very well. I will make arrangements. Once you speak to the other pillars, she asked innocently. No wonder the Kamado siblings have learned to weaponize innocence. They had a terrifying teacher, of course. Oh, and you won't tell Yuzui-san how I would like to meet him. I'd like for it to be a surprise. Sakonji had to withhold a gulp. This was ridiculous. He'd faced down demons, Kazuki even, and yet this woman somehow seemed more terrifying. He didn't understand, but he did realize that he would likely have a connection to this woman for the rest of his life. So he did the smart thing, he nodded. Of course, wonderful. I'm looking forward to officially joining the Corps, even if I will, of course, be coming back here to help train Shidru and Rokuta. No matter what anyone else said, this entire family was a force of nature. Of course, he said again. With a final, satisfied nod, she turned to walk back to the house. He just watched her go, a little incredulous. Well, he had a couple of pillars to track down and several letters to write. It had been a while since he'd been utterly steamrolled like that, but, well, those were the kind of demon slayers they were looking for anyway. Muzan wouldn't know what hit him. And Sakonji needed a drink. XXX. Kamado received a message from his sister the day after he'd dodged thunderbolts. He'd left the lightning cultivators within the hour. The 2 demon slayers were still not entirely sure what to make of everything that had happened. Kaigaku left the day after, mine still on the new, very creepy last resort in his pouch. He also left with one final comment from the lightning cultivator. You can call me Gramps if you want to, he told Kaigaku. I've always considered you like a son or a grandson to me. A week ago, Kaigaku would have scoffed and walked away. He did the same now, but it felt different in a way he didn't think he could describe. The whole experience had given him a different outlook on demons and his job in general. Whatever, Gramps, he muttered once he'd gotten a little ways down the road, cheeks flushed and hoping Gra. The old man hadn't heard him. He'd probably still call him sensei to his face. For a while, at least. He didn't see the beaming smile on the old man's lips. Kimiko watched her prey hurry down the path towards the local village, licking her lips in anticipation. She was so hungry. She scurried along on her 6 hind legs, using them to swing through trees and rush along the ground, barely making a sound. The human, a man in his 2nd decade maybe, seemed to sense her anyway and began to run. That was her cue. With an anticipatory roar, she threw herself at the human's back. They fell to the ground and rolled, the human crying out in pain and fear. She loved that sound. She loved it so much. So different from when. No, she would not think of such times. Instead, she sniffed the human, taking in the intoxicating scent. He was screaming and struggling, but she'd used at least 2 of her hands to dig into the ground upon impact, holding them both down. Despite her relatively smaller size, he couldn't throw her off. She bent down, ready to bite into his neck, anticipating the lovely taste running over her tongue. He wasn't there anymore. Or, she wasn't. She'd left 2 of her arms behind. She blinked in shock. How? What? It hurt. But she'd been scooped up so quickly. She cried out in pain looking back at her prey. He'd gotten to his feet and was running away again. No, Kimiko struggled to go after him, but after only a couple of seconds, a voice stopped her. "A child," the voice whispered. She looked up to see that someone had grabbed her. He had tied his hair up under some cloth, as if he were working under the sunlight instead of the moonlight. He also wore cloth to cover his eyes. Those two traits stood out to her first, and thus it took a second to realize he held a sword and had a demon slayer's outfit on. The fear didn't overpower the hunger, but it came very, very close. She squeaked and struggled to escape, but he held her up by her neck. Then he smiled at her, showing no teeth. "Little one, you are so strong to have continued to survive after." He faded off and sighed. "Let's see what we can do about that connection you have to him, huh?" Then, to her shock, he actually set her on the ground. Gently, she stood stock still for a moment as her arms continued to grow. He'd let her go, and he was sheathing his sword. She decided not to look at that too closely and turned to run. "Sorry, this shouldn't hurt for long," was all she heard before something pierced her back. Then a burning pain. Then blackness. XXX. Kimiko woke to arms around her, holding her close to a chest. She hadn't felt that since. Her eyes started watering up and she gasped. Since the scary man had visited the town, Mama had gone to see him with her and Oniai-san. Something was wrong with Kimiko. Her legs wouldn't work right, and then the man just grinned down at her. He'd had pointed teeth and he'd hurt Kimiko. He'd hurt her in the forehead and she'd woken up so hungry. And she'd eaten Mama and Oniai-san. A sob escaped her and she grabbed onto the checkered haori right by her face, turning her head into it. Then she screamed. Hey, a soft voice said to her, soothing. Her head shot up and she saw the kind smile of the man with the cloth around his eyes. Who are you?" she asked. It came out sounding funny because she had weird teeth now, and she could feel something on her head. "Horns? My name is Tanjiro." She sniffed and her breath shuddered. She didn't let go of his haori. "Why you kill monsters?" she managed to get out. He didn't answer for a moment. "Yes." She squeezed her eyes shut. "Are you gonna kill me?" "What? No." Kimiko shook her head. "Why you should. I'm a bad girl." She glanced down at the second pair of arms she had, and her feet were hands. Hands? That looked weird and gross. She hated it. "How could you possibly be a bad girl?" he asked carefully as the countryside whizzed by. He was running. Could people run that fast? She hadn't thought so before. She guiltily focused back on his question. I ate Oniai-san and Mama after the bad man hurt me. Only bad girls do that." She started crying again. She was all alone and it was her own fault. "Oh, dear one," the boy said softly, clutching her tighter to his chest. "That is not your fault. The bad man is the one to blame. He makes people forget things and makes them, well, hungry. When you can't remember what's good and what's bad, how can you make the right choice?" Well, she supposed she couldn't, but I still ate them. A soft sigh. "Yeah, I ate my family too. Some of them." Then his voice quieted even more. "He made me." She gasped again and looked up at him more closely. He did have sharp teeth like her. "Why you kill monsters? But you're one of them. One of us." He snorted a little. "I know it doesn't make a lot of sense, dear one, but once I remembered who I was, I made a promise to never hurt anyone else ever again, no matter how hungry I am. So I hunt other monsters who don't remember and, well, sometimes I have to kill them, but sometimes I do what I did to you. You see, when the bad man turned me into a monster, he didn't realize that I would have a special ability to take his monsters away from him." He grinned down at her, sharp canines glinting in the moonlight. "So you're not his monster anymore, we're called demons now. And I wanted to help you remember so you don't hurt anyone else." Kimiko wasn't sure she quite understood everything, but if she never saw the bad man again, well, she'd like that a lot. So she nodded, not sure what else to say. "How old are you, dear one?" the man asked, looking ahead as if he could see through the cloth over his eyes. Maybe monsters, demons, could. "And what's your name?" She kind of wanted to see those eyes now. "Kimiko," she replied softly. I'm gonna be 8 soon." His hand tightened around her just a little bit. "And I'm hungry. Does that make me bad still?" Because she hated that too. It hurt a lot. He sighed. "No, dear one. I can steal monsters away from that man, but right now I cannot undo the transformation. Maybe later I could try, but..." He looked down at her again as he jumped from tree to tree. He didn't even trip. "But right now, my sister is in trouble and I'm going to go and save her." "You didn't eat her?" Kimiko asked. Kamado-san shook his head. "No, not this time." He whispered that last part and it didn't make any sense, so Kimiko decided to ignore it. "And you're taking me with you?" Her eyes widened. "Are you gonna be my new Oniai-san?" She didn't know how she felt about that. His mouth quirked on one side, amused. "Do you want me to be your Oniai-san?" She thought about that for a moment before shaking her head. She didn't really want a new Oni-san. She wanted her Oni-san. Then how about you call me your friend? She considered that for several seconds before nodding. Okay, and one thing that will help us both, Kimiko-chan, is if you go to sleep. It makes you less hungry. Kimiko cocked her head to one side, confused. Sleeping makes you less hungry. His smirk widened into an outright smile. Yes, but only because we're demons. She thought about that, but it still didn't make sense. That sounds dumb. He snorted. Maybe, but I find it reassuring. It's how I stop myself from attacking people. Well, Kimiko certainly didn't want to attack people, and she liked being held by someone again, even if it wasn't Oni-san. So she leaned her head against his chest again and nodded. Okay, I'll try to go to sleep. For several minutes, she squirmed in his grasp, trying to find a really comfortable position that would let her go to sleep. Finally she huffed. I can't go to sleep, Kamado-san. He said. Then he sighed. Kimiko, go to sleep. The way he said it sounded like a deep voice inside her head and her chest and her heart and her whole body. She found her eyes closing and the world faded away. Hopefully, when you wake up, everything will be better. She hoped so too. XXX. Tanjiro looked at the now sleeping child he carried. He'd smelled a demon earlier, and the fear of a nearby human likely being hunted, and hadn't been able to stop himself from making a small detour. Yes, he was in a hurry to get to Nezuko in time, but she'd be beyond angry at him if he purposefully let someone die for her when he could have saved them. And he wouldn't blame her. So he'd hunted the demon and come across them as they were about to feed, only to find said demon was a young child. She looked so innocent now, with her tattered kimono stained brown and gray from years of grime, and straggly, green hair. He had no idea how long she'd been a demon, but guessed it was no small amount of time. He'd take her to Shinobu-san once he'd gotten to the red light district and made sure Nezuko and the others were okay. Kimiko could sleep safely in the basement there, and maybe he'd have time to try and burn the demon out of her. He was leery of trying now, afraid she'd wake up screaming, afraid he would kill her, afraid he couldn't burn his own cells out of people. While she'd gone to sleep easily on his command, he doubted she'd be able to sleep through the pain of him cleansing her demon cells. He looked ahead, trying not to remember those green eyes of hers pleading up at him, so scared and guilty. No child that age should have that guilt on their shoulders. His teeth ground together. Every time he thought he'd reached the stage of realizing Musen's depravity, the demon progenitor would find a way of showing Tanjiro how wrong he was, or at least reminding him of the depths that man would sink to. A growl built in Tanjiro's chest, deep and rumbling, threatening. It took him a moment to realize he was making such a sound, and he shook his head. No, he couldn't think of that right now. He had to focus on getting to the entertainment district and find the demon slayers and waxing 6. Funny, it didn't seem like the time for that mission. He'd been planning on stopping by that red light district when he had a chance and taking on the Kazuki. But had they started this mission early? Or had it come to that time already and he just hadn't noticed? Had time just gotten away from him? Or perhaps he was so caught up in his own life and his own problems that he'd just forgotten. And they'd never take down Musen like that. He had to step up his game. And making sure no one died from Daki and Jutaro would be a good way to begin. Even if he arrived late, he could burn the demons' poison out of their systems. Because Nezuko couldn't. He just hoped that them having information on the waxing moons would be enough to tip the scale in their favor. They had to hold on until he got there. They had to. He grit his teeth, gripped Kimiko tighter and pushed harder. XXX. Nezuko gasped and tried to catch her breath. She also clutched her arm where the demon had scratched her, feeling blood trickle down it as she faced the woman in front of her. Waxing 6, Daki, she remembered. The now white-haired woman stood there, completely indecent and very much not happy. She was also, currently, headless. And Nezuko had done that. Even with that scarf connection the demon had that made cutting her neck so difficult. Nezuko had managed to defeat her. But even now, she knew that this was where the real fight began. She really hoped she'd made a big enough ruckus that Yuzui-san would come soon. She may not like the man, but he was a pillar and could actually fight this Kazuki on their level. He wouldn't leave a fellow demon slayer like this, she knew that much at least. I'm going to kill you, the woman gasped. How dare you? How dare you bully me? Bully? I'm not the bully here. Nezuko shot back angrily. I'm not the one feeding on people infinitely weaker than I am. That is the very definition of a bully. The woman screeched and then screamed, Oni-san. Nezuko moved her hand back to the hilt of her sword. The other demon hid within the sister's body from what she remembered reading. Now she really regretted not speaking to her brother sooner, as she'd more or less gotten the bare bones version of what she needed to know about each Kazuki. Perhaps if she could get the waxing moon as he got out of the sister's body, she could take care of this herself. Well, she could hope, and she could try. She needed speed here, and she just perfected her 4th form, based off of the water-breathing 7th form combined with the lightning 1st form. Yes, that should give her the speed she needed, but it was not easy on her body. This would be risking a lot, especially as she needed to switch it from a piercing technique to a slashing technique at the last second. Piercing wouldn't decapitate him. She needed the speed of the piercing technique, but wouldn't be able to take off his head like that. She hadn't tried modifying her forms on the fly before, but she was positive she could do it. She had to. Taking a deep breath and centering herself, she ignored the aches in her body as a lump began to grow from Daki's back. Patience. She had to see his neck. The lump suddenly shot up, showing a head, the top of a torso, and 2 hands. There, Nezuko put every ounce of power and speed she had left into the variant on her piercing form. This was definitely not a drifting leaf, more like a stabbing or slashing one. Yeah, that worked. 4th form variant, slashing leaf blade, she whispered to herself as she rushed forward, swinging her sword at the neck of the new head, and then she was flying, her sword out of her hands and the world upside down. What? She landed hard on the ground, what breath still left in her knocked out with a cough she couldn't control as a new voice spoke up, sounding grating and lethargic. But dangerous too. You actually cut me, the voice said with a chuckle. Nice. I didn't even have time to get my sickles out. Are you a pillar? Nezuko couldn't answer, focusing too much on trying to force her body to move, to breathe. She's definitely got to be pillar strength. Daki's voice screamed. Look what she did to me, Oni-san. Look. Hey now, stop crying, the grating voice softened. And you should put your own head back on. Even as the new figure's words sounded cold and a little cruel, he still gently took Daki's head and put it back on her neck. No, Nezuko could only watch as she rolled over, begging her legs and arms to get underneath her. She searched the ground for her sword. There, just a couple of feet away. Move. She mentally growled at herself, pushing past the pain and grabbing for her sword. Her fingers curled around it and then a hand grabbed her wrist. Her already hurting lungs stopped for a moment as she realized there was literally nothing she could do as the matching hand grabbed her Haori and lifted her into the air. Angry tears came to her eyes. Hadn't she fixed this? Hadn't she trained so hard so she wouldn't be helpless again? Oh, what do we have here? Definitely not a pillar. She found herself looking into the green on yellow eyes of an incredibly emaciated man. Was this Jotaro? Apparently, she has to be. Daki screamed, tears in her own eyes. No, she's the anomaly's sister. Daki paused, blinking while Nezuko tried not to cringe. The one Dauma tried to turn. Nezuko looked at her sword hand, but she wouldn't be able to do anything with her blade right now. His hand still held her wrist firmly. Her eyes scanned her surroundings desperately. Where were the others? Someone? Anyone? Yeah, the brother nodded. We should just kill her, Daki said, stomping up to them angrily. Or we should see how much blood it takes to really turn her. Her blood froze in her veins. HMPH, Daki huffed. I don't like it. But didn't you sense her heart rate pick up? His sadistic grin widened. My guess was right, it scares her. It's the best torture, making her forget everything. The demon slayers, her family, force her to join us. No, she would not let that happen again. She calmed herself as best she could and focused on her leg, drawing it back. She didn't have the leverage she needed to really do damage, but even emaciated demons had family jewels, right? She swung her leg forward with as much power as she could possibly manage. Jotaro suddenly squeaked and dropped her. That was more satisfying than she'd like to admit. Oni-san. What did she do, Oni-san? Daki yelled, hovering over her brother. Nezuko didn't wait. As soon as her feet touched the ground, she made sure she had her sword in her hand, then turned and ran. Using what breath she still had, pushing her body to its limits. She had to get away for a moment, find Yuzui Sanor. She tried to skid to a halt as Jotaro appeared in front of her, an angry grimace on his face. She fell backward, unsteady and scrambling for a decent foothold. She tried to dodge. Even sitting on the ground, she still moved to dive aside. It didn't work. He still managed to thrust his hand into her chest, fingers buried there. She could only stare at him in shock for what felt like an eternity, but then something, his blood, began to flow into her system, increasing the pressure in her already damaged chest. She coughed blood. Your brother isn't here right now, he whispered into her ear as the pain in her lungs exploded. So why not come to our side? Never, she thought, but all that came out of her mouth was a scream. It hurt so much. She scrambled at his hand with hers, silently begging him to release her. Kamado, a loud voice yelled out behind her. Oni-san, it's the pillar, Daki shrieked. Hold him off, Jotaro shouted. Muzan-sama will be pleased if we bring her back as a demon. Nezuko grit her teeth and yanked at his hand. His hand didn't move. Oni-san. Daki shrieked and then his hand was gone. Finally, Nezuko fell to the ground, but the agony didn't dissipate. She forced herself to remain awake, despite the burning that spread from her chest. She couldn't pass out now. She had to fight it. She had a resistance. She could overcome this. And yet she remembered that the waxing 2 had only dripped a couple of drops of blood onto a scratch, not pumped however much waxing 6 had just. Could her resistance be overpowered by sheer amount? She didn't want to think about it. It was getting hard to think. Another scream escaped her. Her hands felt funny. All of her felt funny. "Oh, Oni-san," she whispered. The world looked funny, too bright. Knock knock, little bunny from the mountain. A soft voice and a familiar lullaby reached her ears. "Ka-san," she sobbed, unable to even turn her head and look away from the dirt of the street. No, it was deeper than that. The words were familiar and her mother's tune, but "To-san." Yes, that sounded right. "It hurts." Her tongue ran over sharp teeth. "No, why are your ears so long?" "To-san," she cried. "I don't want to be a demon. When she was small, my mother ate the leaves of a tall tree, and that is why my ears are so long." Another wave of pain had her shrieking. Her back arched. Her throat hurt from screaming so loudly for so long. "Nezuko-chan." That sounded like Zenitsu, Nezuko, and Inosuke. She didn't know he could sound so scared. She wanted to tell them she was fine, that it would be okay, but all that came out was a growl. Each have her eyes always looked like that? She heard Inosuke ask. "No," Zenitsu shrieked. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she found she didn't care enough to stop them. "I'm gonna go help Yuzui-san," Inosuke said. "You're just gonna leave us here?" Zenitsu shrieked. She didn't want to be left alone. "But, go," she ground out, her voice hoarse. "What?" Zenitsu asked. "Go," she hissed. "Kill the demons." But the yellow-haired boy protested. "Go." It killed her to say it, but there were people who needed help. I got you." Jutaro crowed triumphantly from the fight down the street. "Finally, now you'll die of poisoning." Nezuko forced herself to look up at Zenitsu through her tears. "Please." He looked like he was about to faint. And then he did. Nezuko actually blinked for a moment. Then a new wave of pain had her body cramping up. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed that he stood again and vanished. "What?" Then she cried again, her fingers digging into the dirt. She hated that she was alone again. Knock knock, little bunny from the mountain. "Why are your eyes so red?" "Breath, Nezuko." The voice came to her again. "Oh, right." She wasn't really breathing right now. She forced herself into the pattern of breathing she'd modified for her Vine style. "No, breathe," the voice said, emphasizing the last word. She paused, changed her breaths just a little. "To match her brothers, to match her fathers. Inakami, Tegura," she whispered, then forced herself to continue in that vein. It still hurt, but the pressure and shifting inside her felt bearable somehow. For the most part. "Hinatsuru," Yuzui-san yelled. Nezuko looked up. Jutaro had a woman by the throat on a rooftop. Yuzui-san was battling Daki's scarves and couldn't reach them. She couldn't see Zenitsu or Inosuke. No, she had to do something. She had to. She looked around. There was her blade. "Fourth form variant," she whispered, pushing the oxygen and energy into her legs, slashing leaf blade. Normally she imagined vines spiraling from her sword, but she could have sworn she saw a combination of her vines and Oni-san's fire bursting out like blossoms. She didn't get the demon's neck, but she did manage to get his arms. For a moment, she stood between the demon and the woman while Jutaro looked at her, shocked. "You can still move?" he asked. "And you aren't a demon yet." She went to answer, but a growl escaped her throat instead. Then more pain racked her body and she fell to the roof tiles, her sword clattering beside her. "Or you are, but aren't? No wonder Muzan-sama is so interested in your family. Perhaps I should call him here. I mean, he's busy right now, but I'm sure Nakheim would come and hold you for him. He said you weren't a priority, but you just fell into our laps here. Kamado Nezuko, I am in your debt." Yuzui-san's voice said as his sword came right for the demon's neck. He dodged, of course, away from Nezuko. She slumped and focused on her breathing again as the battle continued back down in the street below. "Breathe through it, Nezuko. When she was small, my mother ate the fruit of a red tree, and that is why my eyes are red. To-san," she whispered. "Help me, please." Then she heard Daki shrieking again. "Nai-san." More pillars. Nezuko looked up. "Oni-san." But then she saw two flashes of black and white. No red involved. "Oh, Shinazugawa-san, Iguro-san," Yuzui-san said slowly, warily as the other two pillars touched down on the street behind him. "Disgusting demons," Iguro hissed, his sword already drawn. Then he glanced to the side at the wind pillar. "Will you be all right, Shinazugawa?" "Yeah," he muttered, although he looked tense and above being ready to fight. He was also drooling. Was Nezuko, too? She couldn't tell. but she could smell the blood. Was she hungry, or was that just the pain coalescing in her stomach? Go help the others, Yuzui-san said. On that rooftop over there. She couldn't see where he'd gestured to, but could hear sounds of fighting in the distance. Yeah, Shinazugawa muttered again and then jumped onto the roof on the other side of the street. You're not looking so great, Iguro-san said to the sound pillar. I think I'll stick around and help you out. Yuzui-san seemed to contemplate that for a moment, but then nodded. Jotaro glanced up at Nezuko and the woman. She could tell he was thinking about retreating. Before he could, though, both pillars attacked. It was a blur and Nezuko was too tired to really try and keep up. Hey, the soft voice of the woman Nezuko had saved drew her attention. The demon slayer looked over at the woman's kind smile. It reminded her of Oni-san's. She started to cry all over again. How about we get you away from here? Nezuko sniffed and nodded. Hurts, she managed to say. The woman frowned. Where? Everywhere. The woman glanced around again, but then heaved a sigh and shook her head before smiling again. My name is Hinatsuru. What's yours? Kamado Nezuko. What an adorable name, the woman said with a grin. Now come on, let's get going. No, Nezuko shook her head as something occurred to her. I could hurt you, Hinatsuru snorted. Please, I can take a newly turned demon. If that's what you are. Is it? Nezuko paused and looked down. Her fingernails seemed normal and her teeth felt fine when she ran her tongue over them, but they still felt funny in her gums so. I don't know. Well, you seem like you remember enough to understand what's going on at least. And you saved me, so let me return the favor. Nezuko let out a sob and nodded again, allowing the woman to help her to her feet and then throwing Nezuko's arm over her shoulder as they limped away. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. And comment down your opinion on this video. Thanks for stopping by and I'll see you in the next one.